Management and Planning Session for today, Thursday, May 7th. It's 9 a.m. and we'll stand for the Pledge of Allegiance and then get on with the meeting. I pledge allegiance to the flag,
United States of America,
and the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible,
under God, indivisible,
with liberty and justice for all.
justice for all.
Thank you. Okay, we've got 4 items on today's agenda. Before I do that, I'll just mention that we did receive a few emails today for public comment, and we don't typically have public comment at these management and planning meetings. So I'll just let the people know that sent the emails that they will be forwarded on to all of us council members, and they will be read, and they'll also be in the record as well. So now for the items, council members, before we get into the heavy world of 5G and everything, I think a lot of people are probably more interested in the item C here. So I'm wondering maybe if we could start with C and then work our way back down the agenda. Is everybody all right with that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, well then that's what we'll do. We'll start with the item C, which is State of Local Emergency Phase 1, Safe, Smart, Step-by-Step Plan for Florida's Recovery.
Hey, Mr. Mayor, I just got a text from John. He just needs a minute. He's having a little bit of problem with his Zoom. Give me a minute. Get someone to help him.
Do we need John to get started with this conversation?
Well, Mayor, in light of the email he sent this morning regarding executive orders, it probably would be a good idea. You've had a chance to see it yet. It's rather lengthy.
Mr. Mayor, he did an excellent memo giving some timelines to all the various issues we've been wrestling with. And I think it would be helpful not only for us, but to the public to have him go through that.
Yeah, sure. Well, we're going to have a little dead air time then.
So there's nothing in our packet, though. That's all from the emails that John sent?
He just
That's
sent, it got sent first thing this morning.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be very helpful.
Yeah, there are a lot of moving parts in there.
Roger, just as we're killing time, had a couple questions about the restaurant situation and enforcement. It's a little bit confusing, but I'm sure you know the detail. Is with respect to those folks sitting outside and the 6 foot rule, is obviously you can't have groups of 10 or more. Is the 6 foot then the 6 foot between tables? Is that how
Yes,
you're?
sir.
Okay.
So it's not between people sitting at the tables?
No, it's 6 foot between tables, although it does create the challenge of, you know, if you're there with your family members, and I think you all come to know when we talk about family, we talk about blood family members, it seems to be fine. You have 2 friends who just happen to be meeting for a meal, you know, probably in a perfect world, we probably want those people to be sitting 6 feet apart. But clearly that hasn't been encapsulated in all this legislation.
Okay, John's with us now. Welcome, John. We've decided to go out of order, John. We're starting with item C on the agenda, the state of the local emergency. And everybody seems to think that you should start us out on this.
That's fine, and I apologize for having the information. I've sent an email to all of you all because there continues to be some, I guess, uncertainty at the community level and the public level regarding what we've done and what the town has done. How does that interact with what the state has done? And I think we all can agree that I think part of the uncertainty or misunderstanding is that there are so many of these orders out there, and some of them, particularly at the state level, appear to, in some instances, contradict themselves. But briefly, and to the point of the issue of the hotels and motels, which appears to have generated the most significant amount of conversation and comments, the governor has issued an executive order by the number of 20-87 very early on in the COVID-19 crisis. And it's a statewide prohibition on all vacation rental occupancies and reservations. That order has in fact been extended by one of the governor's most recent orders, which is Executive Order 20-112. The specific sections is Section 3D of that executive order. That particular executive order does not have a termination date as of yet. It is open-ended. So as it relates to vacation rentals, the statewide, the governor has stated that vacation rentals cannot be open, cannot take reservations until such time as he lifts or otherwise modifies his executive order 20-87. That is how I read it. That is how other local government attorneys read it. And that is how we have been explaining it to members of the public that inquire or through to us as staff, either directly or through individual council members. Section 2.8.1 of executive. Sorry, go.
1 second, please. Are there any questions of the attorney on that item?
John, just continue. This is very helpful, but could you continue to sort of clarify that as it relates to what the town has done? We've set the May 15th deadline. Obviously, if the governor does not, if the governor doesn't opine on this before May 15th, then we're going to have to come back and change our date. Is that fair?
That's fair, or we take the approach that we are currently taking, which is that as it relates solely to vacation rentals, 20-87 is still in effect by virtue of 20-112 and would supersede any order that the town has entered or issued as it relates to vacation rentals only. It's very clear that the governor has said vacation rentals aren't allowed to operate and no reservations are allowed with no particular end date in sight. What in the email that I sent to each and every one of you, what I have explained is that when you all set that May 15th date, we didn't have the benefit of the governor's executive order 20-112, which extended 2087. There was the anticipation that 2087 would have expired at the time that you all issued what is declaration number 6, setting that May 15th date. So the May 15th date is still there, but it doesn't allow vacation rentals. That is how it would be interpreted. You can direct staff to modify declaration number 6 to make that clear, but that is how we are in fact interpreting it and moving forward based upon the governor's order 20-112. There's nothing else in any of the orders that talks about hotels, motels, transient uses that we've otherwise limited, and consistent with your direction and to be consistent with the other adjacent local governments and not put our hotels, motels, et cetera, at a competitive disadvantage. We adopted that May 15th date. That's still there. There is the hope and the anticipation that the governor will in fact issue a phase 2 order, and that phase 2 order will address hotels, motels, transient uses, maybe not, including vacation rentals. And obviously, depending upon that, if that happens before May 15th, we may have to modify declaration number 6, or it may be that the governor, when he does enter a phase 2 order and it does address that issue, he may say it supersedes everything else that anyone's done before.
Okay, thank you.
So John, quick question. There's some concern or some confusion about the short-term rentals. In our order, we said that on the 15th, they could start taking reservations. Is that the case because the superseding of 112, are they not allowed to take reservations?
Yeah, yes. They
Okay.
can't. They can't as it's written right now. And the governor's order does in fact supersede the towns.
I just wanted to make that clear because a lot of people have been asking that question.
Okay.
Unless there's any other questions, that it summarizes what we've done and what the governor's done. Again, as I said, there's the hope and anticipation that he'll issue further an additional executive order, hopefully before the 15th, that will give us some further guidance on the opening of hotels, motels, transit uses, timeshares, as we have limited them. Other than that, I would say that our regulations in our emergency declaration number 6 are substantially similar to what the governor has entered pursuant to Executive Order 20-91, which is the Safer at Home order that he issued last month. That has a lot of these prohibitions that we've incorporated into Declaration number 6.
I have a question about what to tell people who are calling us to complain about enforcement. If they go into a restaurant and there is obviously more than 25% capacity, et cetera, and they wish to lodge a complaint, I've been telling people that we aren't the person to call because we don't have enforcement powers over that. Who should they call?
I would suggest they call the sheriff's office, the DPBR, the Division of Business and Professional Regulation, which has state authority over restaurants, a regulatory and enforcement authority. They have their own agents that have the same type of law enforcement powers that the sheriff would otherwise have as it relates to enforcement of state rules for restaurants. So those were the two places I would recommend people to call.
I'm assuming those folks aren't working in the evenings, however. It would be the sheriff you would have to call if it were a supper time or after.
Yeah, I mean, then obviously our local law enforcement that we know that is 24/7 is our sheriff's office.
Thank you, John.
Any other questions?
Any additional questions?
I had what do we do, Roger, if people are jumping the gun on the short-term rentals and going ahead and renting already? We just call town hall and notify?
We're on the issue of them beginning to take reservations.
No, I'm talking about people moving in and staying.
Oh yeah, if they're renting, please notify us and we'll send out code enforcement, investigate, and if we believe there's a violation, the person will be issued a notice to show that they're in compliance, and if they don't, it'll go from there.
Okay. All right.
And because that's pursuant to the state regulation, then would the sheriff also be enforcing that as well, John? John, you're muted.
That's a nature. I apologize. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
Just going to the original issue that you mentioned, if we see that situation as well, besides the public, we do report it to the police, the overcrowding of a restaurant, et cetera.
Right. Well, we'll go back up to the top of the agenda now, and we'll go to item A, which is the new world of 5G, wireless communications, connectivity, and the cost of progress. Want to start us out on this, Roger?
Well, this item came up because one of the counselors saw the article in the League of Cities publication. And it's the first, I guess, big parent case. There have been others before this, but this is the first sort of big obvious case where the state has preempted local governments. Normally we would have some permitting control over communication devices, etc. We can't stop them from putting in. We have some level of control, and this is really the first case that I'm aware of, and John may be of others, where basically they can come in and tell us we're putting it in here, and there's literally nothing we can do about it. We've had a couple installed. We had one that we didn't like the location. We talked to the installer, and these are contractors who work for the powerhouse communication companies. We asked them to cooperate and move the thing a couple of feet over because we thought it would be a better location, and they did it voluntarily. But that's about the extent of what we can do in terms of controlling where these poles and devices go. And as we've all talked about in the past, trying to get on Zoom and with our internet coverage here on Beach, I'm sure there'll be more and more places as they try to fill in the gaps, the signal gaps, that these poles and devices will be installed.
Just a question. I mean, does 5G require closer spacing to the repeaters, or are they the same that is in the 4G kind of spacing? On the technical side, I don't know exactly what their technical parameters are. If it's they have to see it the next one or not. But like I said, they pretty much would say we want to put here, and short of being in the middle of a driveway, there's not much we could do about it.
Commissioner Avich, if Councilmember, I can add to that. This whole concept of these smaller poles is really not necessarily gap coverage, as you referred to, but enhancing the service so there are fewer drop calls, unstable internet connections that we all may be experiencing these days because of the demand. Because of the demand that many people are foregoing traditional phones and increasing the number of wireless items in their home, whether it be smart TVs, laptops, personal phones, etc. And so instead of putting up bigger towers, the idea is to put in smaller, more compact of these smaller facilities in more places to help fill in those gaps. While the state has significantly preempted this area, if you read through the article, there is some reference to some jurisdictions having adopted some regulations to the extent that they can. There's a specific reference to the city of Coral Gables. I provided a copy of that or a link to those regulations to you all by separate email, and that for you all to take a look at it at your convenience and then direct us either if you've had an opportunity to take a look at them, or just say, hey, staff, please take the initiative, go ahead and do that. According to the article, they're putting forth, they're mentioning the city of Coral Gables regulations as kind of the gold standard. That's one of the ones that they, in writing this article, that whoever wrote it said, this is a good regulation as an example, and we can look at that. I've reviewed it. I in fact know the attorney who prepared those regulations for the city of Coral Gables. It is a template that has been used in other jurisdictions, and subject to your direction, we can do so as well for the town.
John, I had a chance to review that this morning. It came in while I was sitting here after I signed in and was looking for something to do and noticed your email. I noticed that it asks for the providers to register with Coral Gables. It indicates that the provider is to provide plans upon request, which seems kind of odd to me. It seems like they should just have to provide the plans. And they do have to get a right-of-way permit according to the Coral Gables. I didn't have a chance to read everything, but those are things I pulled out real quick. It would certainly seem to me like it's a good idea for us to go forward with some kind of similar legislation here so that we have some idea of where they're putting things so that we can communicate with them.
Madam Vice Mayor, they do pull a permit, just so you know. We do review the plans. That is occurring, and we could codify that further, as suggested by the town attorney and by yourself.
Do you not think it's necessary for them to register with the town?
To be perfectly honest with you, I could see where you could make a case where that is a requirement above what the state law specifies and could be subject to dispute. But while I'll go with John's guidance on that, if he thinks appropriate to have that in there, we'll recommend it.
To add to that comment of the manager, I think that is, Vice Mayor, that is why what otherwise might be mandatory language in a regulation such as this, there's some permissiveness because of the state preemption issue. Again, this is one that is out there. It is recognized as one of the leading examples, one of the first jurisdictions to adopt these types of regulations. It's been used as a template, and if it's the will of the council, we'll work on and bring it to you at the next meeting as for first reading, or if you want next month's M&P for you all to review a draft of an ordinance.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, sir. Yes, Jim.
Yeah, I just wanted to chat a little bit about this. We dealt with this a lot when I was on the Utility Regulatory Commission in Indiana, and this is one of the few instances that state preemption does make some sense. The 5G dynamic will really revolutionize both residential customers as well as commercial and business customers. And the state did this primarily because if a major telecom company had to deal with all the wide variety of regulation that would occur, it would be extremely difficult to implement 5G. So this was sort of done as a greater good. Having said that, these telecom companies are extremely concerned about what entities like Cape Coral has done, and not necessarily in a bad way, but they're very interested. And I would just say that the way the town is doing this now, if telecom companies have been non-responsive to some of our very practical requests to move things a few feet over and just make adjustments where they make sense. If you begin to build that communication level, will not be as sympathetic to their statewide needs if they're not responsive to the community needs. So it's a relationship that develops between the local community and the telecom providers. I guess where this ordinance might be helpful with respect to the Vice Mayor's thought is we do have a few small actors out there who are sometimes a little bit rogue, and it's more difficult to communicate with them, and they can be a bit non-responsive if we're not careful.
Well, Jim, with all due respect for your position on this, the article seems to point out that people are already not behaving, that they're placing poles in front of historic structures, in front of art installations that towns have paid for. And my experience personally with the business of getting my internet, my cable, et cetera, I have found a lack of respect and a lack of service from those providers. personally. So they haven't built up a very good reputation with me. And I'm concerned that they're going to come in and just place stuff where we don't, I mean, we're trying to look at a plan to make Times Square better and to make a park on Bayfront. And if they decide to come in and put something in the middle, I'd like to at least have something in place where we can say, look, you do need to communicate with us and tell us how to contact you, etc. We can't control them, but we can at least have something in place to say they have to stay in touch.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I guess all I'm kind of putting forth is that it does not have to, there are some bad actors out there, but for the most part, it does not have to be an adversarial relationship. Times Square is a great example. We're going to want 5G coverage in Times Square for all the folks who are in that area using their phones. I mean, that's going to be a nice draw and a benefit to both our residents as well as those who are visiting. So again, if we can begin to build relationships with some of these telecom providers, and maybe they could, we could work in partnership with them as we draft this ordinance. Not that they're going to be writing it, but they can have some input so we can begin to develop those lines of communications, and then it becomes a partnership, and it's not necessarily adversarial, and we can sort of help each other if you can build that kind of a relationship. I think they have an incentive to work with us. They do not want an adversarial relationship with the town, at least the good actors. But you're right, Vice Mayor. We certainly want something in place to make sure the bad actors have to follow some sort of appropriate course of action.
We could do both.
That's right.
Mr. Mayor,
Yes, sir.
I got a question for John. Do we have any latitude in there as far as the aesthetics of these towers that they're putting up?
There is some discussion in there. Excuse me. And there is language in the Coral Gables regulations about, compatibility, it's particularly with, the surrounding area, as the Vice Mayor pointed out, not putting something in front of a piece of art. Not that we have that situation, of course. I think that from, if I may, from the perspective of the town, our most significant concern is always going to be that of safety, and that this community has, and along with the county cooperation, has invested a significant amount of money in Estero Boulevard and the sidewalks. And if one of these companies comes in and puts in a pole and doesn't restore the sidewalk to what was there before, I think that is where the focus of the regulations that we would suggest be adopted and are contained within the Coral Gables regulations to make sure that these companies repair what they may have damaged to the condition they were before, and that entails, obviously, as the manager indicated, having them come in for a permit to begin with, to allow us to say, hey, wait a minute, you got to make sure that you put back the right of way the way that you found it, and we can incorporate aesthetics as well. Most of the examples of these towers that I've seen are intended to incorporate into the area. A lot of them look like lampposts, for example, if they're along on the sidewalk. But we can certainly provide for that in the regulations.
Yeah, I could just tell you from working with these companies when 4G was coming out, they can be very creative with what they make these towers look like. Rexanne, you'd be interested to know there was one done in Jacksonville that was done in a cathedral of a church, and you can't tell it's there. Even if they told you it was there, you couldn't find it. So I'm wondering if we do have some latitude, if we could work with them when they do come in with a permit about what maybe it could look like. We may not be able to tell them where it goes, but maybe we can give some suggestions of how we'd like it to look.
Well, I'm also concerned about where they go from the perspective of we are using the entire right-of-way downtown for sidewalk width so that we've got room for our bicyclists as well as our pedestrians. So if we start giving that up to more poles, that's going to have, I think, a detrimental effect on safety for our pedestrians and cyclists.
I assume there's regulations, like they can't put a pole in the middle of Estero Boulevard. right? That for as transportation, there must be some kind of limitations. But one thing that I was thinking, listening, is that we're going to be putting a lot of, this is putting a lot of poles, and I don't know how many poles they're talking about and how many different parties. We're also looking at poles for potential streetlights down the road. I'm not sure if these organizations have a relationship with FP&L where FP&L allows them to put these on their power poles. I know sometimes FP&L is very picky about what goes on their poles. And I know it's probably a little early to be talking about lights, but it seems like if you're going to have a pole and you're going to have power to it, that might be a potential place to put a street light.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, I agree with Bill there on that. The power companies do have relationships with these telecom companies, and particularly with the whole redesign of Estero, it's a great opportunity to combine and be mindful of the 5G needs as we put in this new lighting system. And second of all, again, I agree with the mayor. I think we can do both. And the vice mayor, quite honestly. I just want to be sure, John, as you're drafting this ordinance, that you're in communication with the telecom companies. And let me just tell you why. Not that we need to be, kowtowing to the telecom companies, but as they look at where they're going to expand and the pace of their expansion and who goes first and who goes last, they do look at these ordinances. So I just want to make sure ours is in sync with them in a way that creates a spirit of cooperation and not adversarial, because if we do that, then we go to the bottom of the list. And let me just say the advantages of 5G for both residents and businesses are dramatic. And we just want to do it in a way that's cooperative and makes sense, but still preserves the rights and concerns that the vice mayors have brought forward.
Sounds good.
And do they usually have a grand plan of, say, Fort Myers Beach, of where the lack of coverage is and where they may or may not have to put a pole? Is it something we could get in advance to see future down the road where they plan on putting things?
It's not necessarily a lack of coverage or a gap, as the attorney has said. It's literally putting in the 5G system. They do have to be closer together, and it's much more intense. But let me just tell you, having seen a lot of information on the 5G piece, it's revolutionary and can really be a benefit to our island in many ways.
Well, council members, I would suggest this morning that we appoint Council Member Agarholt as our liaison to these companies, and maybe he can have lunch with them or go out and play golf or do something and start establishing those relationships ahead of time. What do you think about that, Councilman?
I'm not a golfer, but I'm happy to work with the attorney to build those relationships and the town manager to make sure that they have, at a minimum, that we protect our rights, but also that we do so in a way that doesn't limit our opportunities to be a 5G community.
How many different providers are going at this? I understand what kind of the idea that someone would come up with, an individual company would come up with the plan, but really there's a lot of competing companies and they all have their own plans. I know
it's a big challenge, Bill. That's a very good question. And it's a big challenge because there's a lot of duplication.
And I know that it does seem like on appearance that a lot of competitors cooperate. They'll share towers and things. I know in my industry, oil companies would be sharing pipelines, have, be partnerships and pipelines. So a lot of times some of the competitors, but they also know what the bottom line is. And so if they can share a resource and save them money, they will do that.
I think it's a good point.
Okay. Anything further on this topic?
In any conversation, though, I think that, if they are in the right place and we can have it, and we're having a dialogue with them to make if they put in poles, to make poles so they're compatible with streetlights, that we could later come up with an agreement with them to place streetlights in, that might be beneficial.
Very good. Very good. And the whole idea of coordinating it all now with the project that's underway would be the ideal time, I suppose. So hopefully that'll happen. Okay, we'll move on.
So just to summarize, Mr. Mayor, our takeaway is that the staff is going to draft an ordinance that I guess begins with the framework of Coral Gables, and we'll make whatever appropriate modifications to that are needed from there. So we'll have that available for you at a council meeting, and if you feel that it needs hard scrubbing, we'll defer it at that point to an MMP. But I think with the Coral Gables as a model, we should be able to be pretty close in the first go round.
Very good. Very good. Okay, thank you. Good luck with that, John. The next item is item B, which is Town Council Policies and Procedures Manual. Resolution 1847 adopted the Town Council's Policies and Procedures Manual. And from time to time, we take a look at it. So that's what we're doing today. Town Manager, you want to start us off on this one?
So, Mr. Mayor and members of the council, this was put on the agenda at the request of the council. As stated on the blue sheet, the last revision to the policies and procedures was in December of 2018. These policies and procedures are pretty much, for the purpose of governing how you all conduct yourselves for the most part. And I guess it's appropriate, as we have 3 new members of the council, to spend a little time going through it and see if there are amendments that are supported by the majority of the council, or this sort of, I guess, almost historical document that's been tweaked slightly over time is going to meet your needs.
Well, I'll tell you that after I was seated again in this last election, my last election, I had the opportunity to get the copy of the Policies and Procedures Manual and went through it, having not looked at it for 20 years. And it's quite a impressive document and quite comprehensive. And going through it, in my experience, I didn't see anything at the time that really required any tweaking, but that's just me. I'm sure that there's others that have looked at it and want to share their thoughts, and we'll listen to those now.
Mayor?
Yes.
One thing I saw, and it's on page 16,
Okay.
where it down in section 9, 1, 2, 3, the 4th paragraph doesn't seem to be a sentence or a paragraph. It's just a line out there, and I don't really know in context. It seems pretty self-explanatory, but it doesn't really connect with another phrase anywhere. That one that says communications with potential applicants for zoning and communications with vendors or service providers, and then it goes section 3452 in the next paragraph.
Yeah, I think that's the, it looks like a separate paragraph, but it's really the answer to that. To that communications with potential applicants section. It wasn't indented or something, but it's really the answer to how to communicate with those people.
It almost seems to me to be a header without any kind of emphasis. So does it lead into the next paragraph?
I think my reading of it, Counselor, is that the part that begins section 34-52 explains that those matters, communications with potential applicants for zoning and communications with the vendor or service provider, clearly the land development code matters are quasi-judicial and ex parte, and if you want, we can try to sort of split that into 2 groups. Might be better to have the zoning and vendors and service providers separate if you wish us to. We could try to clarify it.
Probably just really organizing it, because like I say, that little paragraph is not a sentence, doesn't have punctuation, and it almost seems like
I think the problem is, if you look up a couple of lines, you see mail processing procedures, and it says mail for the town, blah, 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 blah. I just think that there's a space between those 2 things. But I do see that it doesn't make a clear, the answer, which begins with section 3452, does not make a clear delineation between zoning applications and vendors and service providers, and perhaps we should.
I would agree that the tweaking to that section would be helpful to make it more clear. The thing that came to mind for me, I've been trying to pay attention to what we've had issues with in the past year on council. We did add to this policies and procedures manual a method for when we hire a new manager and a new attorney, but we don't have anything about our evaluation procedure, which we do annually for both of them. And there was some dispute and discussion and disagreement during the last year when we went through that process. So it might be a good idea that we include the evaluation procedure for those two persons in our manual. That would be a suggestion I would have.
Sounds all right to me.
Yeah, and looking at this whole section, Roger, to get back to section 9, and maybe what it is it almost like there's to be section, subsections, because there's headers there, but then there's no lettering or anything on them, like there is in section.
I think we could do that, or we could just so it's obvious that where the answer to the item is, or both.
All right, and I agree with Rexanne, by the way, to lay out the evaluation, the annual evaluation process.
Anybody else have anything they'd like to add to the policies and procedures?
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, sir.
I just had a thought. I'm not exactly sure the best place to put this, but it might be helpful. And quite frankly, I have a question even for John. In our current state of affairs today, as to how we function in a state of emergency. First of all, are we in a state of emergency still? And if so, it sounds like there's a unique set of dynamics that come with that. And I wonder if that should be laid out somewhere that might be helpful if we have future emergencies as well, just sort of what the process is, and what is life like under that process. John, would you take a second and just opine on that?
You do have a couple. There are provisions in the code which we can forward to you that are actually referenced in a couple of in the emergency declarations, the sections of your town code that authorize the establishment or the declaring of an emergency, which has been done, continues to be in effect. It also cross-references state statute. So there's a state statute, which is chapter 252. You have the town charter and town code, and then ultimately, to the extent that this council desires to do so and move forward with, you can direct staff to prepare what is called a CEMP, a comprehensive emergency management plan, that then lays out in greater detail the allocation of authority, who obviously in the case of the town, the manager. The reason why a lot of municipalities do that, and it doesn't necessarily apply to you all, is because in a situation where a municipality has its own police force, then in some instances within that CEMP, there's a delegation of authority to the police chief to do certain things to relieve.
And the fire chief.
Or the fire chief, as the case may be, to reduce the burden on the manager to be responsible for all the things that are provided for in the CEMP.
So I guess my question is, are we in a state of emergency right now? And if so, do we have to at some point vote to end that, or?
Yes.
It sounds like that comes with certain procedural dynamics for the council in terms of what could be brought forth, what doesn't require public notice. Just might be nice to have a little section somewhere in the code or in our policies and procedures that just, again, we don't have to get into the minutia of it, but just at least touches on that. So I think as folks come into this, they have a better idea of what that option is and what the implications of that option are.
Just to be clear, your code provides for two types of declarations of emergency. One is a renewable one that has to be renewed every prescribed period of time. So it's good for 7 days and has to be renewed every 7 days. And then there are others that you turn it on and then you take an action, turn it off. That's what your code currently provides for.
Which one are we in right now?
We're in the one where it's turned on until you turn it off.
Okay. I just thought maybe in this procedure manual, it might be helpful just to at least touch on that, maybe at the 10,000 foot level.
You know, again, we can add that. I guess I always get concerned when we have two documents where we then, you know, we make a change to the code, and then we sometimes don't always remember to make a change to procedures. In a perfect world, if it's in the code, it's in the code. And if it's not in the code or needs to be detailed more, it's in the procedures. But we will do whatever you deem is appropriate. Again, just because, you know, we declare a state of emergency, for example, doesn't mean that where normally I could buy something over $25,000 in the state of emergency, I'm doing it right now. That's not affected by the emergency. So by way of example, if I was buying masks for the town staff and it went over $25,000, I would, and it wasn't timely where I could take it in front of council, I would do that. But if I was buying paper clips, I wouldn't, because it's not part of the emergency.
Yeah, again, this certainly is not meant anyway as a criticism. I'm just trying to help new council members understand what our options are and what those options mean. And just to sort of touch on that state of emergency, that we have two different ways to do it. And here's what happens if we do it. And here's why we might want to do it or might not want to do it. I just think it would be helpful for a new person to be able to see that and understand it. Again,
I think a good way to do that, Councilman, would be to just say have a heading for state of emergencies and say,
Refer to the code.
and reference the code to where that language is spelled out. So at least, at the very least, you don't have to go hunting around.
Okay, that's fine.
Have it mentioned in the policies and procedures and reference it back to the code.
That'd be fine.
I guess my question, Roger, is who from staff are we giving this direction to?
Michelle, myself, I assume.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to make sure.
Now, I would say this, Madam Vice Mayor, as it pertains to the evaluation of the manager and the attorney, it would probably be good if the council picked a liaison to sort of lay out in rough draft what they thought, because it could seem to be inappropriate for us to be designing the criteria for our own evaluations ourselves.
Understood. I'd be happy to volunteer for that.
Sounds like a perfect person to me.
I agree.
How about it? Okay.
Although it would be interesting to see what Roger came up with to evaluate himself.
Does anyone else have anything to add to the policies and procedure discussion? If not, we'll move on. The next item is capital update. That's capital with a AL. Roger?
I believe it was Council Adderholt had brought up this matter at one of the previous meetings. So we are beginning our budget process. And the way our budget process lays out is that we ask the departments to submit their capital needs. And that's step one. And then step two, they begin to work on their operating budget. The way they work on their operating budget, just to digress for a second, is that they work on the personnel. If there are any personnel changes, additions, deletions, changes in classification, a need for changes in compensation due to reassignment of duties, those types of things. Then we look at the equipment. Make sure we have the equipment that we need for those personnel, and then we look at the other miscellaneous operating expenses, copy paper, pencils, paper clips, safety shoes, and those types of things. So just to give the council a minute or two overview of the budget is typically we will give the council a budget that continues the service level at the same level as the previous year. So our estimated cost to continue services at the same level that is being provided currently. So when you receive budget information in the summer, it's going to be for the services that we're currently providing in this current fiscal year. And as part of that, we'll review the staffing in the organization. We'll review the equipment, just so you all understand that. And then we will talk about what we call the add-on list. It doesn't necessarily have to be add-ons, could be reductions, I guess, theoretically, but where the staff is requested to increase that level of service or increase something because they see a need. And we spend a lot of time going through those individual elements with the council. And the council literally discusses and votes on each one of those elements, whether they think it should be included as the budget progresses from a proposed budget to a final budget. So the staff's job is to try to fund those increases, at least the ones that we recommend, without creating a need to increase the budget by having found efficiencies and done other things internally to sort of create that money, if you will. And the last several years, we've done that at the 0.87 millage. The council last year, in anticipation of some larger projects that we knew were coming down the pike, those primarily being Times Square, Bayside Park, and Bay Oaks, made a decision to increase the millage by 0.08 to try to begin to develop some funding for those, what we call the big three projects. You will notice I did not mention street lighting. So that's not in that number. And then, of course, we have other projects that come up that have to be dealt with, but I really, would classify those mainly as maintenance type projects. We had something, it's reached its service life, it needs to be replaced. So having said all that, I just received from our finance department, the submissions of the department directors for the capital program, proposed capital program for 2020. It has not been vetted. It is, I have not had individual discussions with the department directors at this point in time. We haven't discussed priority grant opportunities and a host of other things, but currently that raw list totals $750,000. That $750,000 does not include Bayside Park, does not include Times Square, and it does not include Bay Oaks. My walking around number for those three projects is $10 million. And that's assuming some help from the TDC on Times Square. So,
Roger?
Yes, sir.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. If you just go back a second. If you could break down that 10,000 and 10 million, if you could break that down with roughly between the three projects, just so we have a sense of how that breaks down. And I'm sorry, did you say the 10 million includes the TDC or does not include the TDC?
It assumes some TDC funding.
Okay, and if you could just roughly break down the 10 million between the three
Yeah.
projects.
Well, I believe I have a number. Let's see, I think I have that number somewhere.
On the back of an envelope?
On the back of an envelope number. The number that I'm looking at for Bayside Park is roughly $1.1 million to $1.2 million. The the number for Bay Oaks is a more difficult number because while we've had some very good conversations with the school board, and it looks like we are going to be able to come to an agreement to use some of their property. Obviously, how much property they're willing to allow us to use will dictate how many improvements we can put there, which will dictate the price. So that we're not quite sure about that number yet. The number we have penciled in for Times Square is about $3.2 million. So you could take the $1.1 million, $1.2 million, the $3.2 million, and that kind of will tell you, backing out the $10 million, where we're currently sitting with respect to Bay Oaks. The amount of money that the council created by the millage increase of the 0.08 is roughly $275,000. So
for you.
So if you looked at it from an accumulation standpoint, you could see if we had to accumulate all the money to do any one of those projects, it would take a substantial amount of time. So the question that the council will be facing is whether to do that or recognize this as recognize those three projects as what a term of art would be a generational project, which means that multiple generations will benefit from those projects, and therefore multiple generations should help pay for those projects. And that would put the town in, if you subscribe to that concept, that means the town would actually borrow that money and pay it back over a period of, say, 25 years. Now, of course, the town being a municipality would qualify for a fairly low interest tax-free loan that we could get. Wouldn't be as low as the SRF funding, but would still be probably south of 3%. Probably the amount would be close to what you would see for a 30-year mortgage if you looked at online. That would probably be about the rate we would get. And in terms of what it would take to repay that amount, if you went ahead and assumed the $10 million, you're probably looking at, I don't know, $550,000 a year or so for the principal and interest on that loan. So those will be the decisions that we'll be looking at as we move forward with those big three projects. As you know, the Bayside Park, the council has authorized design subject to 30% review by committee. The council has authorized the Times Square design to move forward. And the Bay Oaks phasing plan will be as soon as we get that sort of the first draft of the agreement with the school board as to the property, so we know what the four corners of the property would be. So that's the status of those things. Just turning back to the department needs.
Before we leave that, Roger.
Yes, sir.
Now, is there any chance for TDC funding for the Bayfront Park?
Well, I think that, there's always a chance. The TDC funding is, prescribed by state law. And I think the vice mayor will tell you that the county attorney takes a very, very conservative view of that law in terms of her evaluations of the projects. We do believe we have we have an opening, if you will. I don't know if it's an opportunity yet, but it's an opening by virtue of the connection to the waterway, by virtue of the finger thingy dock that we're contemplating putting there. But how that'll ultimately be reviewed by the county attorney, I can't predict at this particular point in time.
In addition to the fact, Bill, that the TDC funds come from the bed tax, the information I've received from the TDC recently is that those are down around 80%. So there's a huge
Deficit.
yeah, there's a lot less money than there was. So
Right.
and it's going to take some time to build that back up.
And I know it's broken up into percentage, right? There's a certain percentage for the ball field deal. There's a certain
Correct.
percentage for shoreline maintenance. And then there's a small percentage for everything else.
There's a big percentage that goes to advertising. A
Yeah.
very big percentage.
And what about, I mean, other potential grant ideas? As I know that the Bayfront could be, probably considered transportation infrastructure, if we're using it to service maritime transportation.
Well, I will tell you, Counselor, that our best position in terms of getting grants is to get to be shovel ready, because whether it's the federal government or state government or whatever trying to restart the economy, there may be some opportunities for grants to help us fund these projects. I always caution people that if it's a good idea, it's a good idea, and you need to be prepared to do it with your own money. That doesn't mean you don't fight like heck to try to get grants and explore every grant opportunity. But if we're waiting to get grants to do these projects, we may be waiting a long time.
If I may, just to piggyback on Bill's question, but to apply it to the Times Square renovation, if I could ask Roger and the Vice Mayor this question. Before the virus occurred, when you all were looking at the Times Square renovation, and it sounds like that project's more germane to the requirements of TDC funding, what was your hope of the cost of, out of the cost of the 3.2 million, what was your hope in a perfect world, which we don't live in, that you thought the TDC might cover of that 3.2 million as you were speculating?
Well, we don't have that. I can tell you, Councilor, we don't have that level of detail on the cost estimate yet. But our thinking was that walking down to the pier is probably the biggest beach access on Fort Myers Beach. So we assumed that at least the surface and perhaps some of the lighting would be clearly to help people get to the beach and enjoy the beach. The structure for the restaurants, perhaps less so.
Unfortunately, though, that's a precedent we're going to have to argue to set aside, because they currently do not consider that part of our town to be a beach access.
That is correct. And it'll be a heck of a conversation when we have it.
As most are.
I know, Roger, you circulated a document a while ago where, was it from the state where, or the federal government, where they're recommending public spending as a stimulus as well? And I assume that may translate into a policy down the road from the government, but we'll see.
Well, I will tell you that in all the places that I've worked, and this includes the various managers that I've worked for when I wasn't a manager myself. One of the philosophies has always been, if you're not willing to invest in yourself, why would other people invest in you? So the entities that were successful continue to make investments. They continue to do replacement and rehabilitation when it was needed. And because of that, when there was an economic downturn, they were the first ones to bounce back. And the ones who seem to be more delinquent in making investments in themselves and keeping the quality of their product up there were the ones that were the slowest to bounce back.
If I may, Roger, real quick, the county just announced that they received a massive infusion of dollars from the feds from the CARE Act. I believe it was, I think they were even surprised at the amount. Do you have any optimism that the town of Fort Myers Beach might get a piece of that for some of our challenges? Not necessarily as it relates to these projects, but as it relates to the impact of the coronavirus?
Well, I can only tell you how I looked at things when I was in county administration, and that is that I worked in a county that had 34 cities, and we always made sure that that when the county was fortunate enough to be a recipient of federal funds, that we made sure our cities got some of that money. I believe that the county commission recognizes the importance of Fort Myers Beach to the overall county economy. And I would be hopeful that they would find a way to share some of that funding with the town and the other municipalities.
That very conversation came up, Jim, in our call with the fellow mayors of the county. Naturally, all of us wanted to share in the pie,
Right.
but the requirements were so stringent upon the municipalities, having to have an ungodly amount of residents and so forth, that none of us qualified. But the point was made strongly to the county commissioner on the line that we expect and to be included in the distribution of these funds once they become available. So the message was made. Now we'll see how it actually comes to being. But so they are aware of that, and I think in the spirit of cooperation and goodwill that something will come of that.
Very good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
But I do concur also with what Roger said that, the more we can have shovel ready, the better we are positioned to maybe get funding that we wouldn't otherwise would get.
I agree with that too. We're criticized for focusing on these sort of things when there are other emergency items coming up and so forth. But the fact of the matter is you have to keep these projects moving. Otherwise, you go back to the back of the line again once the funding opportunities present themselves. So I'm all for that being shovel ready. I'm all for that.
I'll just add to that comment, Mr. May, by saying the thing that kills a project is when you lose momentum. That's
Right.
the thing that kills it faster than anything else.
You're absolutely right. And it doesn't take much to lose momentum. It doesn't take much. Okay. Have we discussed that enough? We'll move on to the agenda management. For the new members, I don't know, have you sat in on one of these yet, agenda management sessions with
I
us?
believe it's the first one.
Okay, it's I just familiarized myself with them in the past year myself. These are items that have been brought forward by members and added to this list, and then we kind of prioritize them and get them to future agendas. So there's your list there, and we'll just open up the discussion and see where this leads us. Anybody want to jump in? Anybody have any pressing issues on this agenda management? I've got one item that's not on the list, Roger, if I may. Back in the horse and buggy days of the town of Fort Myers Beach, we as a council used to get a regularly added item on every agenda, which was a financial report. And basically all it was an income statement for the month of the town. And it gave us members an idea of where we stood financially. And it was also in the spirit of transparency for the town and for the citizens. It was a chance for them to get an idea and keep up with it as well. I mean, there are certainly a lot of other issues that are going on now since then, but I mean, I think we could still put something together that could be referred to once a month, and just to let everybody know where we stand at that particular point in time. Does anybody agree with me on that, or is there any?
I think that would be very helpful, Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Mayor, I just wanted to remind the council that we typically put out departmental reports mid-month or to all members of the council, and within those reports there is financial information, but clearly we can add more or detract it if they're not quite hitting the mark. And of course, we'd be happy to post those on our website for people to view from the public if they so desire.
Well, then people are really looking for things. Then, if we just had it listed as a recurring agenda item that they knew was going to be on the agenda every month, they could refer to it from time to time just to get an idea. I'm trying to simplify these. I know it's probably going to be a little more work for the staff to put it together. I don't know how much more, but just so people will know.
They're reconciling. They're reconciling every month. So
Right.
the month closes and they spend basically the first 2 weeks of the month reconciling the previous months.
Right. So I mean, you could have it at the second meeting.
And then that report is the report that I was referencing that we share with the council.
Yeah.
But
Well,
we can
it'd be
you can
nice
put it on the agenda if you want.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Anybody else have any?
Mr. Mayor, is this the type of list where or is this sort of ad hoc because of the state of emergency? The language John is working on regarding outdoor seating in our restaurants, would that go on this type of a list, or is that a sort of a separate set aside item?
That's a good question. I don't know.
Mr. Mayor and members of the council, in that regard, I've spoken with Mr. Green because I thought it was very important for him to be involved in that discussion, because in all likelihood it is his department that will be involved in the approval process. We have put something together. It has been forwarded to the manager. And we will be working on it. So to the specific question, it doesn't have to be included. We know that this has to be brought to you, and we will be bringing it forward to you and distributing it to you separate and distinct from the agenda management spreadsheet.
If I might,
I'm sorry.
I think one of the things we need to add to the agenda management is the 5G ordinance, Michelle, because we did discuss that today, and I think there was consensus for John to move forward on that. And just by placing it on agenda management, it keeps us all from forgetting about it. In addition, we agreed that we were going to interview the various firms that we will be looking at for the review of our comprehensive plan and TDC project. So we might need to add that as well.
Right. Madam Vice Mayor and member, I know you know this, and I know the mayor knows this, perhaps the new council. So just remember that this list was generated before Monday's meeting.
Sure, I'm just making sure.
But I appreciate your good note taking to make sure we don't miss any of these things.
And last, I would mention, I see that we still have the mechanical noise issue on there, but one of the things that I think has dropped off that we had discussed in the past was looking at redefining the footprint of a home on the property. I learned when I was looking at that issue that we did not include, for example, pool areas. So we have houses that literally have, I mean, they're they look to me anyway, they take up 80-90% of their lots when our current code does not take into account that the footprint, to me, the footprint needs to include these things, if that's possible. So I guess I would ask for some other council member to agree that that's something we need to look at redefining the footprint of the homes.
Just we have some pretty small lots here, Roxanne. Are you proposing this from a permeable surface proposal, or is this from because it's not blocking a view or really infringing on neighbors?
No, I'm not looking at it from a blocking a view perspective. I became aware of the fact that other municipalities do have a more restrictive view of what the footprint of a home is. And I understand on a very small lot that we may need to make allowances for that, but it's still something I'd just like to take a look at.
Yeah, because we had a rental house, and the neighbors put in a pool in the backyard, and that raised the level, and our backyard became more swampy.
Well, that's a whole separate issue. We do have an issue. We've been reevaluating runoff and drainage. We actually made some fairly recent modifications to that, but I'm not sure how well they're working. I've been hearing a lot of complaints about it still. So but to me, that would be a separate thing to add.
Right. Well, we have a discussion at the bottom of the list about pervious versus impervious and drainage below ground, and how we're gonna deal with this drainage issue, because we have a variety of problems. The most obvious problem is that when you have a new house being built at the current elevation requirements versus a house that's been in existence for a number of years that was built under the elevation requirements for 10, 15, 20 years ago, adjacent to one another. So we have that. Then, as part of the new house issue, how are we going to arrange for them to accommodate their stormwater on their property? And the additional engineering and costs associated with that, whether or not we're going to impose that or not. So we are, in the years that I've been with the town, we shifted from people complaining of the people who were being flooded by the large houses next to them to now we have the complaints of the new houses, large houses being built, the additional time and expense of dealing with the stormwater on their property. So that's been the paradigm shift that I've seen since I've been here. And then we have the other issue that the Vice Mayor is mentioning of, yeah, we look at the primary structure and the lot coverage, but then we start getting all these other auxiliary structures on the property. And before you know it, there's 3 blades of grass and 3 pieces of rock, and that's about it. And everything else is pretty much covered over in the seawall. So, this is a balancing act, and there's no answer. It's just one of these things that the council is going to have to look at from time to time and adjust with the current situation that's out there. Because you're going to, no matter what you do, you're either protecting one party or you're adversely affecting another.
So Roger, do you think it's appropriate that I ask for a separate look at defining the footprint, or are you including it in this drainage that's already on the agenda management?
Well, I think it's part and parcel of that, because right now the item is a discussion of pervious versus impervious, and right now these ancillary structures that you're referring to are not included in our baseline calculation. And what I'm hearing from you is it's worthy of discussion whether some or all of them should be.
I'm just trying to get to whether I need to get another member to agree with me to add an extra item for redefining the footprint or not.
In my opinion, not that we are against having another item on the list, but I do believe that your comments fit into the context of the listed item too.
Thank you. That's all I ask. If I have your assurances that staff is going to look at that in a big picture, I'm happy with not making a separate item.
We'll make it clear what's included currently and what's not included, so the council can look at that and see if the line is drawn in the appropriate place.
Thank you.
Roger, is this a place where we could add potentially a review of the governor's phase 2 and phase 3 so that we're maybe prepared a little bit as to how it relates to our situation?
I think that when the governor, if and when the governor releases his phase 2, it's going to be one of two things, Counselor. It's going to be we could tweak our declaration to address, for example, the short-term rental ban that's currently in the governor's, to bring ourselves in line with that, or if it's more comprehensive to deal with that issue. We won't know till he releases it. Generally, what happens is a day or so before, kind of leaks out through the media. I don't know if that's done intentionally to sort of get a preview of what the reaction is going to be. But depending upon how comprehensive it is, I'll be working with the mayor to determine whether we need a special meeting and setting that up or not. If it was purely just a release of vacation rentals, I would venture to say we don't need a special meeting. Just like the county manager did, I would modify the order to accommodate them, but I'll discuss that with the mayor at the appropriate time to see he feels if it's comprehensive enough to bring the council in or not. And of course, I'll be talking to each of you as well.
Okay.
Back, if I may, just going back to the conversation about the extension of premises. My notes reflect that the council left the extension of premises as a request from the businesses to the manager for me to review, and the direction you gave me at that time was to be as flexible as we could be.
That's correct.
Okay, so just for the record, I wanted to state that as of today, I've not received any. And if I do receive any, I will be as flexible as we can be.
No one has come forward yet and asked to.
No one has approached me on that subject at all. And I think the main reason for that is that in many cases they're on somebody else's property. They're not on a town's. So they have to work with their landlord. But I'm here and available. And if you hear of anybody who would like to contemplate doing that, please direct them to us. Now, going back to what the town attorney said about himself and Mr. Green, we have been looking at what the other municipalities and the county have required for extension of premises. And in order to be flexible, I don't necessarily want to be exclusively bound to the counties or exclusively bound to Benitez or somebody. I want to be able to be flexible to deal with that individual set of circumstances where that individual business is situated. If we try to start writing something around that, it's going to fit somebody and not fit somebody else.
Okay.
Yeah, I do think, Roger, that because I agree with you. There aren't a lot of places where we have right of way where businesses are, except for Old San Carlos and maybe Times Square. But I think that any reasonable proposal someone would make, as long as it didn't impede pedestrian traffic either on the sidewalks or on the beach or get into the EZ zone, I think would be pretty reasonable. But I do, along those same lines, kudos to the beach vendors who have sent you what seems to be some well thought out plans for reopening.
Right. So on that subject, Counselor, we have sent an email out to all the beach vendors late last night. listing how they can begin to reopen. We set a reopening date of 5/15, just to coincide with the other date. However, we did say that if they would like to open up earlier, we will consider that on a case-by-case basis. The primary potential impediment to that is we want to make sure their insurance is still in force. That as a cost-shaving measure, they didn't suspend or cancel their insurance, and we want to make sure that's been reinstated.
Okay. Any other questions?
Mr. Mayor, I think 3 pretty quick questions. Number 1, just informational. The numbers to the left of the agenda management, they're not in order. Is that just to identify them, or does that list some sort of prioritization?
No, it doesn't list any prioritization, Counselor. That's the order that that's the order they got on the list, and it's just so that when we could talk about number 10 without having to read the verbiage.
Okay, and then rehearing 200 Pearl Street, are they coming back again?
So what I can tell you that they've made a request for a rehearing that's being evaluated and processed by the town attorney in conjunction with Mr. Green. I suspect that request for rehearing, not the rehearing itself, but the request for rehearing will probably be on your next agenda. If you're not fully familiar with that process, what that is, they explain why they feel they're entitled to that rehearing, and you then will have staff's analysis of that request, and you will make a determination of whether or not a rehearing is appropriate or not under those circumstances. If you vote for a rehearing, then you have that rehearing at a future date.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Jim. Anyone else?
You know, I have a topic, and I'm not sure if this really belongs on agenda management, so I'll throw it out there. But there's been news that the water bill for 2020 that's coming through the federal Congress now has a savings clause in there in the Central Everglades Restoration Plan, and that essentially forces the management of Lake Okeechobee to be primarily for agriculture. So it prohibits discharging water during the dry season, and and making room for potential wet season high levels. My feeling is that we should at least make an effort to make a statement against this, because our water quality, well, thanks to the drought and thanks to better management levels, we had really good looking water last summer. I really hate the idea that we're going to, in the shadow of COVID, that they're going to pass laws that are down the road going to come back and bite us and our businesses again. So is that something that belongs on our agenda, or is to make some kind of statement towards there? Or is there something we can do with our lobbyists to direct them towards that?
Well, our lobbyist is a state lobbyist. We don't have a federal lobbyist. But clearly, if there's consensus on the council, we could draft a letter to the South Florida Water Management District and the state DEP and the Army Corps of Engineers stating the council's position on the matter.
We could also write our representatives.
Of course, we would copy our two senators and our member of Congress as well.
I'd be in favor of moving ahead with that.
If I could I have no problem with that, but let's, instead of copying our 2 U.S. senators, since this is a bill going through the United States Congress, that should be our directive, is to influence those 2 members of Congress. I'm sure two senators. Of course, our member of Congress is in transition. Still helpful, obviously, to let him know that. But I think the letter should be directed to, because whenever a member of Congress gets a CC, it's generally not as important as if it was directed to him or her. So just again, process-wise, let's let's direct it to our two United States senators and our member of Congress, and then copy the other people as opposed to the other way, particularly since this is a bill before Congress.
Agreed, Jim.
Yeah, I do too. And if I don't know whether this is appropriate or not, Roger, but I'd be more than happy to help draft that.
That'd be great if you could do that and send it to us. We'd be glad. That'd be helpful.
Yeah, we'd all get a look at it before it goes out. That'd be helpful.
Oh yeah, I think there'd be some discussion. I'd be really interested to of course, in the sunshine, draft something and get Jim's input, particularly knowing what's having insight on what's effective to our elected leaders.
Very good. Anyone else? Okay, hearing none. We're going to adjourn this meeting here, and apparently there's a workshop following this meeting for any members that are interested with the town attorney regarding various items, parliamentary procedure, resolution and ordinance processes, and sunshine laws and ethics overviews, and so forth. So whoever's going to hang around for that.
Mr. Mayor, I would say that we'll just take a few-minute break and then we'll reconvene with, I guess, John running the meeting at that point. Unless
Very good.
If I may, just before we lose any members of the public is welcome to stick around for this. If you want to better understand the internal process of our town and procedurally the legislative process, I would welcome, since we're doing this all under the sunshine laws, I would welcome the public to, generally those who are still watching are junkies anyways. If they would like to learn more about our process, it might be a good opportunity to hear from our town attorney as well.
Okay. The video will be continuing.
Okay, thanks everybody. Have a great day.
Okay,
I'm going to go get some coffee.
see you in 10 minutes, so 10:40-ish.
Yes.
We're done with the meeting. The town attorney is going to conduct a little workshop training on ethics and sunshine law and stuff like that. Yeah.
Amy or Michelle, if they're available, to take a brief roll call. So the minutes will be able to reflect who's attendance at the council level. I think Amy needs to, is probably the one manning the.
Yeah, hang on, I had to unmute.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, John, I wasn't listening. What do you want me to do?
Oh, a brief roll call, the council members present, so it's a matter of record, so for the minutes, to the extent that we produce those minutes.
Okay, no problem. Present at this workshop meeting is Councilmember Jim Adderholt, Councilmember Bill Veach, Vice Mayor Rexanne Hossafras, and Councilmember Dan Allers. We also have our town clerk in the meeting with us. She's muted. Michelle Mayer. We have Town Attorney John Herron, and Roger Hernstadt still shows that he's in there, but excuse me. And this is Amy Baker, Deputy Clerk and Contracts Manager, that is talking to you.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and I appreciate you all making yourselves available, and for Councilmember Adderholt suggesting this. I want to start by saying that you all should know already. I'm having spoken with the clerk. I know that she's already advised that each and every one of you are required to take a mandatory 4-hour course on some of the subject matters that we're going to discuss. And that is separate and distinct from this discussion we're going to have today. And to the extent that any of you have already taken that course, which I believe is is available online to each and every one of you, to the extent that there's any overlap, I apologize. But since I don't know or haven't seen that video personally, I'm not exactly sure what issues are covered there. So with that understanding out in front of us, go ahead and proceed to first and foremost about the Sunshine Law and how it applies to you. The Sunshine Law is a statute that the legislature adopted a number of years ago in response to perceived abuses and perceptions, real or otherwise, that elected officials were taking action on matters of concern to the public in the proverbial back room. And as a result, to paraphrase the statute, is whenever 2 or more elected officials are going to gather in any location on a matter that at which it's anticipated that a matter of public concern of the town would come to be discussed, it must be noticed. It not only must be noticed, but the minutes have to be taken of that meeting, and an opportunity of the public to participate must also be provided. There's obviously some nuances to that. There's a statutory exemption to the public participation, where I'm able to meet with each one of you collectively in what's called a shade meeting to discuss litigation and litigation strategy matters that are not subject to public participation or outside of the normal process. There are some safeguards that the discussion has to be transcribed by a court reporter, and that record of that meeting does become public at such time as the litigation is concluded. The other most common exemption to the Sunshine Law that comes into play and really wouldn't affect the town because we don't fall within those parameters is negotiations regarding collective bargaining. And since we don't have any collective bargaining units, that exemption is unlikely to apply or will not apply to any of you all until such time as the town were to have such a need to have that type of meeting. In regard to the Sunshine, my advice in general is that whenever any of you all believe that you may be attending a meeting where another council member may also be attending, and it is foreseeable that the discussion will come up on an item that ultimately will come before the town council is to advise staff, and then we can post the appropriate notice so you don't run afoul of the Sunshine Law. Let me give you a specific example where I think that might occur. Is each and every one of you have been appointed as a liaison to some of the other outside boards, let's say the TDC. More than one of you want to go to a particular TDC meeting because an issue of concern to the town is likely to be discussed at that TDC meeting, then certainly I would recommend that you reach out to the manager or Michelle to inform them of that, so the appropriate notice can be posted at Town Hall and on the town's website, advising that that is going to be that one or more of the council members are going to attend that meeting, and therefore general public is allowed to attend and observe, and you've now complied with the Sunshine Law.
John, could I ask a question about that?
Oh, absolutely. At any time, please.
Frequently, I will find that more than one of us will show up at a meeting of our LPA. My policy has always been that I just sit there and keep my mouth shut. I'm there to learn and hear what they're doing and not to communicate with another council member. If we find that we have, more than one of us have shown up at a meeting like that, is that a good safety thing to do, to just stay quiet, and that way because a notice hasn't been put out, we just stay quiet?
Yes. But I would also say that that the LPA meetings are noticed as public meetings anyway. So there is a notice provision with regard to the Sunshine, and it as a prophylactic, as a protective measure, as we move forward, is we can put into those notices that, please be advised that 2 or more council members may attend the meeting, and we now have double insulated ourselves. But the best practice is, if 2 of you do show up at such a meeting that's already been noticed separately as a public meeting, is to refrain from any discussions, or at best that just one, if they feel compelled to speak, speak, and the other one or others, please, refrain from doing so. Go ahead, please.
But in these meetings, there's a council liaison who speaks regularly. So if there's another council member who's in that meeting, even though it's publicly noticed, is the council liaison talking to the committee with another council member present a violation of the Sunshine Law?
No, as long as the other council member doesn't engage in a back and forth with that particular council member on that subject, that then will be moved on to the town council. To the vice mayor's comment before, is just sit and observe. Don't engage in a back and forth with the council member is the best practice.
All right, thank you, John.
Just again, John, clarification based on both questions that have already been asked. So for example, Bill chairs an advisory committee. Is the LPA committee the only one that publicly notices? Do the other advisory committees, they do not submit public notices? Is that correct?
No, that's actually the opposite. Is any meeting of any advisory board that you all created also has to observe the Sunshine Law. And so their meetings are separately noticed as public meetings as well.
So there really is no difference between an advisory committee and the LPA meeting. They're both publicly noticed, correct?
That is correct. They're both subject to the Sunshine Law.
Okay, and I knew that, but I thought you were inferring that the LPA was different because it was publicly noticed and the other advisory committees were not. That is indeed not the case, correct?
No, I was just using them as an example in furtherance of the vice mayor's comment where she identified the LPA.
Okay.
It applies. The rule applies evenly to all advisory bodies.
Okay. And again, if the Chamber of Commerce is having an event or a forum and more than 2 people show up, how do we handle that?
Well, those aren't public meetings in the sense that they're not sponsored by the community. But if you know and you want to actively participate in that meeting, then again, it would be the best practice would be to give notice to the clerk that you and likely more council members are going to go to that meeting. A notice can be posted that where the meeting is, two or more council members may show up, and at least you've met the sunshine requirements by doing so. Again, the best practice is if you show up and another council member shows up, whether or not it's been noticed or not is to then refrain from discussing and just listen. There's nothing that says that you can't go to these meetings as long as you don't actively participate and engage in a discourse with the other council member on an item that is likely to come before the council that you know will come before the council.
If I could ask our vice mayor, who's got a lot of experience in this from a practical standpoint. So if you're going to a ribbon cutting and 3 other counselors are there, obviously you're not having any conversations on issues that would come before the council. Do you literally contact Michelle and say, hey, we're all going to be at this ribbon cutting? I mean, that seems a little much, but if that's what we do, that's what we do. What's your experience been, Madam Vice Mayor? Oh, I think you're on mute. You're on mute. Oh.
I haven't been to a ribbon cutting, but I can tell you that generally we haven't been notifying Michelle. It's just been my practice that I don't speak publicly at those meetings. And if I happen to run into you at a meeting, I will greet you, but not speak before the group publicly with you.
And let me that is the best practice. The added layer of protection would be if you know in advance to notify the clerk and ask for that meeting to be posted. I know some jurisdictions that they ask the elected officials early on, hey, where are you going to be going this month, and they post everything. And I'm not saying that we need to. With respect to, I'll defer to the clerk, but like on a ribbon cutting item, if it's a public works project of the town, my guess is that's being noticed.
It does seem that we have these fundraising events that, we're a small town, and you go to them and it's like everybody from every committee and town council seems to be pretty well represented at them.
Okay, let me, that was the next thing, and I appreciate that. That's a proper segue into the next topic on the sunshine that I wanted to address, which is the sunshine law does not in any way, shape, or form prohibit any of you all from participating in social events where one or more of you may attend. The limitation that you all are all bound by is not to engage in a discussion with another council member at any of these meetings, fundraisers of that nature, on an issue that is likely to come before you. It's a self-disciplined, self-regulating issue. If the meeting turns into a single subject discussion on, what is the town going to do about this or that, my suggestion is that one or more of you walk away if it hasn't been publicly noticed, to avoid the potential of someone saying that you violated the sunshine. But there's nothing in the sunshine law that says that you all cannot participate in social events to the extent that you or other members of advisory committees are friends, that you can't continue that friendship. But there is the limitation that you need to make sure that in the back of your mind, you're always thinking and knowing that if any part of the discussion starts to turn toward an issue involving the town, and an issue that is likely to come before you or is going to come before you, is that at that point in time, one or both of you or 3 of you have to say to the person who's speaking, hey, don't mean to be rude, but we really either need to stop having this conversation or we're going to have to walk away.
John?
Yes, ma'am.
Would you speak to the exception, if I understand correctly, political forums, debates prior to elections?
Well, anything that happens prior to an election and you're not on the council, if you're a candidate, you aren't subject to the sunshine.
But if you are a town council member running for re-election?
Yes, then you still have to, be careful about the extent to which you discuss, and on the issue of, someone asked, the audience asked, what are your views on short-term rentals? It's an example. Or conversely, more specifically, if a member of the audience asked you, how would you vote on this issue, on repealing the vacation rental ordinance, strengthening it, or leaving it the way it is? Answering that question in my opinion, is a crossing the line, even if it is a political forum where you're able to answer general questions and state your platform, because you are now telling, particularly if there's more than, if several of you all are running for re-election and you're all attending that forum, you are now publicly stating your intent to vote a particular way on an issue that may be pending. Maybe the question arises because it's scheduled on the next agenda. That would be, crossing the line.
John?
Yes, ma'am.
John, I just wanted to mention something that I have found there's a great deal of confusion about, especially with our advisory committees. The Sunshine Law applies to the group that you sit upon. So I'm allowed to talk to the members of the advisory committees. I've had an LPA member come to me and say that he didn't think he was allowed to talk to me about an issue. And I think that's something we really need to get out there. They can't be discussing things behind the scenes with their fellow committee members, but they can certainly talk to a council member about an issue.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That is permissible. But what can't happen, and I know that there's, in some of these examples that I'm giving are hard to anticipate or hard to control, but the problem may arise is if you have that conversation with LPA member A or advisory member, whoever it is, and you say to that individual, well, here are my thoughts on this issue. And that individual then calls another council member and conveys that information. The Sunshine Law is very clear that third parties cannot be used as conduits of information that otherwise falls within the requirements of the Sunshine Law. So in those communications that you may have with your advisory board members, I caution you to be, again, think about that, be aware of that, and tailor your comments accordingly. So, and maybe even go so far as saying, hey, please make sure that you keep this conversation to yourself, unless it's at a public meeting. And then, again, if it's been publicly noticed, then you're in compliance and you can have that conversation. But otherwise, there is a specific prohibition. There are cases out there, there are attorney general opinions out there that very clearly state that you cannot use third parties as a method to circumvent the Sunshine Law. So be aware of that, be considerate of that, and keep that in mind as you have those conversations. Another area of where people have asked me, including some of you all over the years and just recently, is, well, what about email communications? There's a whole different aspect to written communications that we'll discuss coming up about the public records law, but there is some crossover in public records law and the Sunshine Law, particularly to the extent that one council member may send an email, knowingly or inadvertently, to the rest of the council members saying, hey, there's this information out there, this is what I think about it. Technically speaking, that's not prohibited by the Sunshine Law. What is prohibited by the Sunshine Law is if another council member hits reply or reply all and responds, and now we have a back and forth, potentially through emails about a matter that's coming before you or is likely to come before you. So again, you have to be very careful that those types of communications are one way and really are only about distributing information of interest to other council members potentially, not certainly refrain from editorializing on that information or support this position set forth in here. It's simply, hey, here's some information on the Everglades Restoration Project that may be of interest to all of you. I've said this to several of you. I know that in my office, as a law firm, we're very concerned about that reply all button. And so we have set up our Outlook items to where the reply all button is completely separate from the rest of the toolbar. So because otherwise it's right next to the reply all is right next to the reply. And sometimes it's simply a matter of the mouse or the finger or the keypad going just slightly over and you inadvertently hit reply all. So, you know, that's something to be aware of, to certainly keep in mind. You will see that in many communications from the clerk, from the manager, and from staff, that there's a what I would call a council grouping, which includes all of you, includes myself, includes the manager and the clerk. I think that's it. There may be some other members of staff. I personally, if you haven't already noticed, when I send out emails from me, I don't use that council tag or grouping. I'll send an email to each one of you or collectively, but by blind copying you individually. So you can't, when you hit reply, it's only to come back to me and to whoever may be in the CC, which is generally the manager and the clerk. That's one way that you can go about avoiding that potential pitfall of electronic media.
John, just one kind of point there is, I noticed when I first brought up the Outlook, the default was reply all. There's one button to reply, but there is a way to go through the settings and change it so the default is just reply. And also, I know sometimes you'll get an email that's sent to council and some other group of citizens, and you can't really tell. You know, if you can be fooled into thinking that it's just these citizens and do a reply all.
Yes. So again, either defaulting to the reply all or even going to the reply all button is, after very careful review, that that's who you intend, and it does not include other council members. If it does, then you're going to have to just separate them out and make sure that the council members are excluded. As I said at the beginning of this discussion on this issue, it's not prohibited, but because of the potential pitfalls, the Attorney General has issued several opinions saying that, almost contradicting themselves. Yeah, it's not prohibited, but we don't recommend it.
John,
yes, ma'am.
I just had something to add to something you talked about a few minutes ago, and that was the sharing of information with fellow council members. The councils in the past have sort of developed an informal policy, which isn't in our manual, that if we want to share something, we send it to Michelle. And occasionally then Michelle can, she can red flag something and say, well, maybe this shouldn't go out, and discuss it with Roger first, etc. So I found that to be a very good practice. I never send anything to my fellow council members. I send it to Michelle and ask her if she thinks it's appropriate to please distribute.
Yeah, thank you very much, because that was what I was just about to say, which is the best practices are, in my opinion, are to send the item to either the clerk, the manager, myself, or all three, and say, I believe this is this article, or I'd like to share this information with my fellow council members. can you please share it or distribute it to them? And what I've seen in most instances, even in today's communications, is Michelle will actually print it out and put it in your boxes up on the second floor, and which is again an additional level of protection, that by printing it out and putting it in your box as opposed to forwarding it electronically, again, there's that minimization of potential hitting reply all or communicating with other council members. So your point is well taken, and that would be my recommendation to each and every one of you, that if you come across an item of information that you would like to share with your other council members, is to forward it to the clerk and to the manager and ask them. And if necessary, they'll involve me in potential vetting of is there any inappropriate information that's being conveyed, and then it'll get distributed to each and every one of you. And then in turn, if you want to provide comments, respond to the manager and the clerk, and again, we can vet that information to see if forwarding any additional information would be appropriate given the requirements of the Sunshine Law. That's pretty much it in the context of the Sunshine Law, except that there is one nuance that you all have already all dealt with, particularly because except I think Councilmember Veach wasn't on the LPA, quasi-judicial items and how they interplay with the Sunshine Law. Quasi-judicial items have heightened requirements from the standpoint of due process, because in those situations, the individual council members are sitting essentially what the courts say as judge and jury. You are the evaluators of the information that is being received by you in that particular on that particular item. You are making an adjudication, a decision on it, and therefore some of the protections that would normally be in a court of law apply here, and particularly what is called ex parte communications. That in court, as a general rule, one party can't have conversations with a judge without the other party being present. So understanding that dynamic, the legislature has adopted a rule or a statute that says that local governments can either opt in or opt out into having ex parte communications in quasi-judicial matters. The town early on decided to opt in, and subject to the provisions in our code on ex parte communications, you can't have them. Those rules are very simple, that you have to maintain them and you have to disclose them, and you at the time of the public hearing, and you have to be able to state in the affirmative that to the extent that you receive those ex parte communications, you're going to make your decision on what you hear at the hearing. The ex parte communications cannot be the basis on which you rely on making your decisions, because again, using the court example, that would be inappropriate for a judge to have outside communications with one party to the exclusion of the other, and then make his or her decision on the merits of the case without hearing from the other side. And so you have to disclose those in order to be able to comply with the ex parte rules that also interplay or interconnect with the Sunshine Law, that all things be done public.
John?
Yes, sir.
I've heard you give this eloquent speech many times at the LPA hearing, but I just want to make sure I didn't mishear you. Did you say we've opted in and you can have them, but you have to disclose them? Or we've opted in and you can't have them, but if you do, you have to disclose them?
No, we've opted in and you can have those conversations, and you do have to disclose them.
That's what I thought. Okay.
Any questions?
One, John. So let's take there's an instance, and maybe when we were campaigning before we were elected, we had communication with someone about an issue that then may come back to council. Is that still considered declarable?
No, unless you want to, because again, these rules kick in the moment that you got elected. Anything that took place before, it didn't. For example, I know in many jurisdictions where people who are running for office after they've been elected have said to me, and it's perfectly legal, oh, I spoke to council member A, B, and C before I got elected on this issue. And that's perfectly okay, and you don't have to disclose that. The requirement of disclosure applies the moment that you win your office. Okay.
John, if you're ready to move on, I just have one final note about the Sunshine Law.
Yes, ma'am.
I was amazed to find out after I had been a council member for some time that the legislature passed this law, yet it does not apply to them.
Yeah, there are a number of instances, there are a number of exemptions from the Sunshine Law. And chief among those is the legislature's exempted itself from the requirement to observe this. Judges are also exempt from the Sunshine Law, and to some degree the public records law as well in some respects. So as we are all experiencing in the context of state preemption, there's also a lot of state exemption going on in Tallahassee, where they create rules for us as local governments, but then turn around and say, but they don't apply to the legislature. And this is one of them.
And we get so many comments from people about how we appear to be disorganized and it takes us forever to get anything accomplished, et cetera. And that's because we do have to comply with this. We can't be discussing these things off the record and in advance. And I find it so frustrating that the legislature then thinks that this shouldn't apply to them.
Your point is well taken. To the extent that any of you all care, I'm rather libertarian in my views, but I will say that it's been my experience after doing this for so many years that in some instances, either through overtly through actions of the legislature such as this, and otherwise, government works slow. I mean, there's always, we always hear that and I'm one of those, by the way. We should be more efficient. We should be more like local, like private industry. Unfortunately, as the vice mayor points out, there are certain rules that are in place that purposely slow down the process, and that is why. And we can only meet in the sunshine. And right now, we meet twice a month with the MNP. That's really more than a lot of jurisdictions do. And still, things sometimes take longer than we all want to get processed. And certainly COVID-19 is not helping.
John, just one additional clarification to piggyback on Bill's question about, for an example, let's say the 5 counselors know, or we may not know, all 5 are going to be a fundraiser for the Mound House, but we all end up there. Are you saying that does not require us notifying Michelle because it's a fundraiser for the Mound House and it's not conducting any kind of an official event, or how do you separate those two from the other example, the ribbon cutting?
Well, in that situation, you still have to observe the requirements of the Sunshine Law.
Gotcha.
You can't speak, so if a member of the public is there and, you're all having soda or a drink and you're talking about the weather and the member of the public then in front of the 3 of you or 2 of you says, well, what is the town going to do about global warming? At that point in time, one or more of you is going to either have to walk away from that conversation, or you're going to have to admonish the speaker, hey, we can't talk about that.
I got you on that. But that particular example would not require the notification of Michelle. Is that fair?
No, what the issue about notification of one or more of you attending a meeting that and that you are, then one or more of you may be attending, let's say, a Mountain House. So a specific example, during manager's report, the manager says, "Oh, I want to remind you all that the Mountain House fundraiser is next Friday, and one or more of you publicly state, oh, I'm going to attend. I'm going to make sure that I put that on my calendar. I'm going to attend." The best practice, not that it's required, the best practice is, hey, Michelle, the town clerk, can you post that meeting as a public meeting? Otherwise, you all have to self-discipline yourselves, because that is what the Sunshine Law says. It is up to each one of you individually to comply with its requirements.
That's fair. If you post it as a public meeting, that doesn't mean we can have any conversation that's official in nature, correct?
That's also correct. It just puts the general public on notice, as well as you and your fellow council members, that one or more of you is going to attend.
Okay.
But it sounds like it doesn't particularly give us any more latitude in what we speak about. It's still the same kind of rule.
That's correct. At the end of the day, the purpose of the council meetings is to take care of the town's business at a public meeting that's been noticed as such. Town council, every second Monday, or the first and third Monday of the month. All right, public records law. Everything that you come in contact with in the way of writings, documents, or otherwise that are sent to you, received to you, or that you send out to other people, including staff members, that is in the course of business of the town, is deemed to be a public record that needs to be preserved. Much like the Sunshine Law, the Public Records Law also has a very specific provision that says that the requirements of both laws are to be liberally construed. So the benefit of doubt goes to, it is a public record, it is a Sunshine meeting. What that means is you all have to be very careful making sure that you maintain those documents, you maintain those communications. And as the electronic age continues to expand, the guidance that local governments have received is it now includes such things as Facebook posts. It includes such things as what's the app that a lot of local governments, the neighborhood app. Have you heard of that?
Yes.
Okay. So that potentially, anything that you would to post on that would be a public record that you have to maintain. Anything that you receive on those apps regarding the business of the town has to be preserved. One of the biggest issues I think that all of you, every elected official, certainly you and everyone else runs into, is the fact that up till the day that you become officially sworn in as a council member, and even after, most people know you by your private email address, not your fmbgov.com email address, and you have to start transitioning. So specifically the Public Records Law requires you to maintain and keep all of those emails that may be sent to you to your private email address that deals with business of the town. And what I would suggest that you do, if you haven't already done so, is to create a separate subfolder, FMB emails, and any email that you receive in regard to business of the town on your private email address, and to the extent that you respond as well, you drop that email into that folder, and you maintain that folder and you protect it so it doesn't inadvertently get deleted, because all those emails are in fact a public record. Your text, same thing.
John,
Councilmember
Veach was first.
So would it be acceptable to just forward those emails to your town email address?
Either way, Either way, whatever's most convenient for you. The point I'm trying to make is they have to be preserved in some form or fashion. And to the extent that you leave them on your Gmail, whatever account that you have, they need to be preserved. That's the point I'm trying to make. If you do so by forwarding them to your fmbgov.com email address, that's perfectly fine as well. The point being, it has to be preserved.
John, I think the forwarding may be the better practice, just from the point of view that when we leave office, public records requests can still be made of those things. And that way, Michelle could do a search of our old email, just so that the other counselors know when I came back on to council and received my email again, all my old emails from my previous stint on council starting 5 years ago were there. So they are maintained. And it's just, I think, easier for the town if we forward things to the town email so they're preserved there.
And I appreciate that. I thank you very much, Vice Mayor. I would point to all of you, if you didn't do so in anticipation of the MNP meeting, if you do in fact go to the town policies and procedures document that's part of the MNP agenda, a lot of these issues are addressed in that document. And I would certainly commend to each and every one of you, if you haven't already done so, is to read through that document carefully. By way of example, I have it up on my screen right now. Hold on, give me a moment. There's like 9 components or subcategories to this document. Number 3, how town council will operate, code of conduct, code of ethics, assignment of a town council representative, sunshine issues, email policy, public records. So there are a lot of resources out there that already exist, including this document, that supplement and add to what the conversation we're having now, as well as the training that you are either have already gotten or will have to get before the end of the year. And last, and one of the things I want to mention to you as a very good resource, if you haven't already done so, when the town advises the League of Cities that keeps a database of all our municipalities for us of the election of new members, you all should have received a packet from the League of Cities, either through the clerk or directly, with a can't remember the name of it. It's like it's a maroon cover, and it says it's like a reference book. That's a very good primer on really most of the subject matters of local government that you all are going to run into, including a discussion on public records, including a discussion on the Sunshine Law, how local governments are formatted, set up, et cetera. So to the extent that you have received or will receive that document, I would commend to each of you to use it as a reference tool and as a additional resource to learn about how things are not only done here in the town, because a lot of those are best practices that we've adopted, but also get a feel for what other municipalities are doing throughout the state, and the view of or how the League of Cities is putting that information out to each and every one of you all. A lot of information out there, a lot of resources, in addition to myself, in addition to the clerk, in addition to the manager. Certainly I would commend to each and every one of you, to the extent that you have the opportunity and the time, to take a look at some of those documents that are out there. Again, the primary component of the public records law is preservation, and the clerk receives, and I have it saved on my computer, I think it's about 150-page document that's produced by the Secretary of State of Florida. That is the official records retention policy adopted by the state that is the guide that municipalities follow, how long these items have to be maintained before they can be purged and no longer considered to be public records. I will tell you personally that I have documents that go back to when I first started in the public field of government attorney, just because they're good resources to have, and I'm a hoarder. Ethics. Briefly, ethics is that you can't take action, you can't participate in official action at the council level if the action is going to have or inure to, this is statutory language, inure to your personal benefit or to the benefit of your immediate family. And there are a number of opinions out there rendered by the Ethics Commission in Tallahassee on the area of ethics in general. That is their responsibility. And I want you all to understand and keep that in mind, because when an ethical issue presents itself that you all have a concern about, as it relates to you, your ability to vote or to take action or even opine on something, you may reach out to me, and I certainly encourage and want you to do so. But at the end of the day, the statute that governs ethics in Florida clearly states that I can only give you an advisory opinion, and that the only binding opinion that you all can rely upon as individual council members is an opinion rendered by the Ethics Commission. So with that in mind, if when an agenda comes out and there's something on that agenda that you have a concern about, but from an ethical standpoint, your ability to vote on it or take action on it, I would suggest to you, strongly suggest to you, that you immediately reach out to me so we can coordinate and place a call to the Ethics Commission in Tallahassee to either get an informal opinion, which they will give over the phone, or if necessary, an informal written opinion if we have enough time. And if it's of significant of a level, to ask for a formal ethics opinion from the Ethics Commission on that particular issue. I have interacted with the attorneys for the Ethics Commission for 20 plus years. They're very responsive. They're very knowledgeable, because it's all they do day in, day out. And they are able, in 99% of the situations where I've communicated with them, to either render that informal advisory, verbal advisory opinion, or even an informal email opinion with very quick turnaround. There have been, in my career as a government attorney, maybe less than 5 times in my experience where the issue was of such nature where it then engendered or generated a formal ethics opinion on the subject matter. And it's easier and better to ask for that opinion than before the matter comes before the council, than trying to get an opinion afterwards. That's what the Ethics Commission kind of discourages.
So, John, even though I know you just said this is something you can't answer, but it seems to me there's, like, when you say that you can't render a decision that causes you to benefit, I mean, all of us pretty much ran for office to make the town a better place, and we are part of the town. So, I mean, if I vote on something that helps my street, and I'm part of the street, how fine does that get?
If you're to get to the point, if the decision is what's happening in the house right next to you, if it's all of you on the street are going to be equally affected, you're no different than your neighbor. But if the decision is about your neighbor and it's going to affect you, obviously, because you're next door, then in that situation, the Ethics Commission, I would suggest to you, you would have to refrain from voting. And the standard is it almost like if the perception, if there's a belief. Now, the flip side to this discussion is there's a separate statutory provision that says that unless you have a conflict, you are duty bound to vote on all items that come before you that require you to take action on. So again, those two sections obviously interact with each other every day, every time you have a meeting. And again, my suggestion is you all look at the agenda before the meeting. And if there's something there that you think is a concern, immediately reach out to me, to Roger, and we'll get in contact with the Ethics Commission as soon as we can to give you some direction that you all can rely upon moving forward. Otherwise, the safe harbor best practice is declare a conflict. If you declare a conflict, there are different rules in different places, but the rule that applies to you all, what we currently have in place, is that you can stay in the chambers under the guidance that's been given by the Ethics Commission on the general statute, which is all we have. You can even participate in the discussion of the item, but you can't vote on it. And just as importantly, within a very short period of time, you need to fill out the appropriate disclosure form and file that with the clerk, so the clerk can then file that with the appropriate government agency, so there's a record of your conflict and that you refrain from voting. Again, the clerk has those forms and can make them available to you.
It is Form 8B, Commission on Ethics 8B, and it says for elected officers, in addition to abstaining from voting in the situations described above, which is inure to your special private gain or loss, etc., prior to the vote being taken, by publicly stating to the Assembly the nature of your interest in the measure on which you are abstaining from voting, and within 15 days after the vote occurs, by completing and filing this form with the person responsible for recording the minutes of the meeting, who should incorporate the form in the minutes.
The other form that you all have to once a year fill out is the Form 1. I think in the first instance, the clerk may have already provided that to you. Once you submit your first, formally submit the Form 1 in your first year, you are then put on the database to receive that automatically. They actually come out around this time of year, and they're due, I think, by July 1st is the date. If for some reason you don't receive your form from the supervisor of elections, that's the state, the county agency that keeps the database, around this time of year, please make sure that you reach out to either Michelle or myself or the manager to let us know, so we can make sure that you get the form in a timely fashion and you are able to submit it. I'm not sure whether or not Lee County, the supervisor elections, do they accept them electronically? Michelle?
I don't know.
Some places where I file mine, which is in the county in which you live, I'm able to do them electronically. I get them electronically and I file them electronically. It's made it very easy, thank God. Otherwise, as I said, you have to keep this in mind. Maybe want to put it on your calendar. I know Michelle will let you know anyway. I think that she does it every year, irregardless of whether or not you have it on your calendar. And so those really are the two most important documents that you need to be aware of as it relates to compliance with the statutory mandates of reporting conflicts and your financial disclosure, your annual disclosure form.
If I may add, 3 newly elected council members provided the financial disclosure as part of their qualifying documents, and that will satisfy for 2019. Vice Mayor Hossafrost should receive hers in the mail to her home address from the County Supervisor of Elections, and they're to be filed by July 1. If the supervisor of elections does not receive it by September 1st, there's an automatic $25 a day fine.
So Michelle, just to clarify, Dan, Bill, and I are good for the rest of this year with respect to filing anything on the ethics disclosure front, financial disclosure front?
That's correct. However, there's and maybe John can speak to the 4 hours of ethics training, and that's recorded on your financial disclosure form. So I think that would be for next year then. Is that correct, John?
Yes, but between now and then, you do still have to take your 4-hour course in order to be able to meet this year's requirement, because it kicks in automatically when you're elected to office. So rather than run potentially the risk of someone saying you haven't complied, I would strongly recommend to everyone to take the course, submit they'll send you a part of the course materials, a certification that you've taken, and in turn submit that to the course provider, and it'll get properly recorded. Again, if you haven't had those, then make sure that you reach out to us so we can help you make sure that those forms are properly filed and timely filed.
John, where can we go to find a 4-hour course?
Michelle,
I didn't understand Councilmember Allers.
The 4-hour course, what's the best place to go to take that?
Well, I believe that was the information I provided to you, John, several weeks ago. And I removed it from the League of Cities website.
Yeah, there's various ways to do it. The easiest, simplest way for you all is to do it online. The statute does allow you to take the course online. It is provided online. I think I recently had a conversation with the vice mayor where she indicated to me that she had taken it, and we can get that link, that information to you if it maybe got misplaced or fell through the cracks. But there's
I would appreciate a link to resend it if it's already been sent.
And that would be helpful, and that needs to be done this calendar year, even though our form is not due this year. Is that correct?
Yes, the statutory requirement is that you take at least 4 hours of ethics training every year.
Okay.
One thing I would ask or remind everybody about is that the new counselors we recommend that you go to what's called EMO training from the Florida League of Cities. It may be possible that training includes the ethics training, so you wouldn't want to have to sit through it twice necessarily.
That's a good point.
You might check and see if that is included in the training, and if it is, make sure you sign up and go to that. I do recommend it. I found it very useful, and I'm hoping to go to the second level of that training as soon as there's one available to go to. And they are offered at different places in the States, so you don't necessarily have to jump onto the first one you see. You know, if you've always wanted to visit Delray Beach, for example, you might want to choose that to go to your training. I'm not sure that they offer the ethics training as part of it, but it would seem to make sense that would be a component.
I'm not so sure why the attraction Delray Beach personally, but that's just me.
It was just an example.
With regards to in general ethics, beyond what we've discussed, I think what is a primary concern to each and every one of you that you need to keep in mind is the gift requirements. I'm going to, I'll forward this to each and every one of you separately, but where is it? It's a three-page document that is produced by the Commission on Ethics in Tallahassee. And it's an overview of laws relating to things of value, gifts and expenditures, and specific references to Chapter 112, which is the ethics statute in general. But for purpose of this conversation, what you need to be aware of is that under state law, as local officials, you are prohibited from taking any gift that is, I'm sorry, you are required to report any gift that you receive that is in excess of $100. And one of the, I think it was Commissioner Adderholt who had a question of me earlier when we spoke about some of these issues, where he's saying, well, I understand that it's a lesser amount. The $100, there are differing levels depending upon what agency you are a member of. There are stricter restrictions, ironically, for the legislature than local government officials after the legislature took a lot of flack for exempting themselves from the gift requirements in some regards. But for your purposes, it's anything in excess of $100. So I often get asked, and this material I'll forward to you will provide you some guidance. Well, what is, how do we know? Well, obviously, if you go to a dinner and your portion of the bill is in excess of $100 and someone else is paying for it, then that needs to be recorded. The statute prohibits the giving of a gift or an acceptance of a gift on your behalf if the expectation of that gift is that you are going to give some benefit to the person who is giving you the gift. That's stated simply, that's a bribe. That's prohibited. It doesn't matter what the value is. If the gift, as it's called in the statute, is given to you with the expectation that you will give some type of benefit in turn to the person who's giving to you, that is strictly prohibited. Beyond that, just general gifts, the threshold is $100. Specific example. It's not uncommon sometimes for local government to sponsor an event locally. In exchange for partial of that sponsorship, the person who's the entity that's putting on the event will give the government 5 free tickets, or 5 tickets, not free. So there is some consideration. To the extent that you get one of those tickets and you attend that event, and that the face value of that ticket is over $100, you have to report that as a gift. And there's some nuances there, but in that regard, but generally when if you're receiving a gift that is of some nature, a ticket or attending an event, the Ethics Commission and the courts have interpreted it as to what is the face value or what is the fair valuation of that gift if there's no face value, and that then triggers the requirement for reporting it. Again, I'll forward this this document to you all. It's a very good reference tool. It defines what a gift is, the disclosure requirements, the prohibition on receiving a gift in exchange for your vote, for lack of a better description or way to paraphrase it. Any questions? Okay. Moving on, the part of the subject matter is about parliamentary procedure. So we don't spend much time going over stuff. That is in your rules of procedure. There is a very specific heading. It is what guides you. It is what is applicable to you all about how you engage in the conduct of your meetings. It's subsection 7 of the resolution: meeting procedures, order of agenda items, conduct of council meetings, rules of civility for public participation, requirement for minutes, council member item and reports, the agenda management, which we discussed before at the prior meeting at the M&P, action list, how voting order is established for roll call votes. Again, there's a discussion about voting conflicts, and guidelines for the quasi-judicial land use hearings that we already talked about. I would certainly recommend to you all to discuss those. You know, I find this subject somewhat interesting. I find it frankly fascinating because some governments have no rules. Some governments do have rules. Some governments simply say, you know what, we're adopting Robert's Rules of Order. My personal experiences, I would never recommend to a government to adopt Robert's Rules of Order, because if you actually have a copy of Robert's Rules of Order, the paperback is about 3 inches thick. And trying to find what Robert's Rules of Order says on a particular issue in that book on the fly is difficult at best. So I recommend what prior councils in Fort Myers Beach have done. They've adopted by resolution these rules of procedure, and that helps you guide. The flip side is that my personal experiences with this council and in the prior council is that you're very collegial. And I don't remember any particular instance where one council member or another has had to admonish, reprimand, whatever verb you want to use, another for not following the rules or being out of order. While I'm not saying that may not happen, the point being is that those rules are there to guide you. Strict adherence to them to the letter, based upon my personal experiences with all of you, is not necessarily needed. You all do a very good job of policing yourselves. And the basic rule is, particularly for council action, is you make a motion, it has to be a second, and then there's discussion. And when at the end of the discussion, it's closed and there's a vote. There's some obviously very specific rules about that. One that immediately may come to mind to some of you is calling the question to try and end the debate. But again, it's really never, I've seen it exercised by this council maybe 2 or 3 times at the most during the year and a half that I've been your town attorney. So again, they're there. They're helped to guide you and to be applied when there's a rough spot. But as a general rule, your running of the meeting is very collegial, and I would certainly commend you all for that, and see no reason why you can't continue to run your meetings in that way without a strict adherence to a set of rules.
Question, John.
Yes, sir.
That's helpful. I want to just kind of steer this conversation a little bit from a practical standpoint. The act of legislating on the council, if one has an idea for a new ordinance or to change an existing ordinance, what's the practical process? Obviously, you want to be respectful of your colleagues and get input and so forth, but does one go to you, John, to draft the idea and then posit the idea to the rest of the council? Do you need a second counselors to approve the idea before we can go to you, John? And how does that process germinate? Rexanne, welcome to chime in as well on that.
I will give you, and I know I hope that the Vice Mayor is going to say what I'm about to say. You all just did that this morning. The process is essentially the item gets put on an M&P for discussion. There's consensus reached that you want to move forward with the regulation, and staff taking the time and energy to draft a regulation. And we then take that, we develop the legislation, and we place it on an upcoming agenda, regular agenda for first reading in the event that it's an ordinance, and through that required process is 2 public hearings. If it's a land use regulation, it has to first go to the LPA. But that is the general process. We just did that with the 5G discussion.
So outside of the state of emergency dynamic, an item has to be on the M&P agenda before it can be considered?
It doesn't have to, but that's the system that has been developed to provide for that. You can bring it up as a discussion item at any point on any regular agenda, as long as either on the agenda or added to the agenda at the appropriate place, and that's within your rules of of procedure, and it's discussed. And if there's if it's at a regular meeting and there's three council members who want to move forward with the item, they can formally vote and direct staff to do so. Or we just simply understand that that's your desire and we'll move forward with it.
John, just to help me clarify, help me by clarifying this. You said if 3 or more decide to move forward with an idea, you need 3 to formally get something drafted and put before the council. Walk me through that process.
Well, under your form of government, no piece of legislation can be adopted unless a majority votes to approve it.
But I don't mean adopted. I mean in terms of bringing it forward, having it drafted, placed before the council, put it on the agenda. That's just, is that 2 that require that? How does it work practically?
There is no hard and fast rule, but as a general matter, from a practical standpoint, do you want staff to move forward with the expenditure of time and resources if there's not more than 2 council members who want to move forward with a particular piece of legislation or a particular matter?
Jim, I think that there is a reference in our policy manual that if someone brings up something and asks for it to be placed on the agenda, that there needs to be at least a second member who shows an interest in further discussion of it before we put it on the agenda and move forward with it. So that, I think that may be where you're getting the 2 and 3 thing going.
Okay, that's helpful. Yeah.
Right. We have to have at least 2, someone else has to be interested in discussing it before we're going to put it on agenda management and move forward with maybe putting it on an MMP or whatever. We don't seem to have a hard and fast rule. Some things go on agenda management and then they go to MNP before they go to council. Some things have been fairly simple and everybody's so agreeable about it that we don't even put it on an MMP, that John has gone ahead and drafted it and it's gone straight to a council meeting for a vote. So that's a little flexible there.
Okay, yeah, I'm just interested in sort of procedural guidance. Yeah.
Yeah, the vice mayor's point is well taken and is consistent with what we were just discussing, which is your rules of procedure are there to guide you and to help us if we get to a sticky point in time on a particular issue. But generally, it's just raising the issue and seeing if there's support for it amongst your peers to move forward. And if there is, we as staff will start working on it. I have seen instances where, 3, 4 council members have said, yes, staff, please move forward with that initiative, that legislation. And when it comes back for actually a vote, the ordinance didn't get adopted, or the item didn't get adopted. But we knew at least that you all wanted to have a discussion on the item. And so at any point under the agenda as set forth in the resolution that that was on your MNP, you'll see, as the vice mayor indicated, language or section about that, and you can always bring it up during council member discussion or at the beginning of the agenda as an addition to the agenda as a discussion item. There are various entry points in the process where you can raise those issues of concern, and you pointed to one at the beginning of your comment, which is going to the manager and saying, "Hey, Roger, can you see if you can place this item on the agenda? I'd like to have it discussed." So there's no hard and fast rule. It's intentionally left, I think, to be flexible, to give each and every one of you various opportunities and entry points to have that discussion and raise those issues, and not necessarily preclude you from raising those issues of concern.
I can tell you, though, that on occasion I have gone to Roger with something, and his suggestion to me was to bring it up during my council member items to make sure that there was some support from somebody else on the council that was interested in going forward with the discussion. So he did not place my request immediately onto an agenda.
And I appreciate that. One additional question. I'm just watching the council. I don't think I've seen this in play, but when an ordinance is before the council for discussion, there's often it seems like a very informal amendment process throughout the discussion. Is there ever a recorded vote on the amendment apart from the question, or is it just sort of a hey, what do y'all think? Procedurally, how does the amending process? What's the formal dynamics of the amending process?
If I may, again, Commissioner Adderholt, that has been somewhat flexible purposely to give the opportunity for give and take. I think that when there has been a need or it has occurred to have a separate vote on the amendment is when the amendment has a very significant impact on the underlying legislation. If it's a large amendment or complex, then generally the rules allow for that amendment or that vote to be broken up. And that's when it happens. And there have been instances, not many, where the council has taken up the vote on the amendment first to make sure that everyone agrees with it. If it's not as a large or a significant impact upon the underlying legislation, in many instances, the amendment is voted on as part of the initial motion for approval. And so you'll hear, move to approve as amended.
And the amendment has to be germane to the question?
I'm sorry?
The amendment has to be germane to the question?
Yes. I mean, if it's not germane to the question, then again, under Robert's Rules of Order, as a fallback, it would be out of order.
Okay.
If it's completely separate, then you potentially would bring up, hey, I think that this issue needs new legislation that deals just with this.
Can I just clarify, Councilor Adderholt, what you basically have is two types of amendments. What's called a friendly amendment and what would not be called a friendly amendment.
Right.
Friendly amendment would be one that is perhaps, the most person who made the motion and the seconder would believe that makes the item better. And there's two ways to do that. One is they can incorporate your amendment into their motion. And you may have seen a time where the seconder and the motion maker says, yeah, I accept that. Or they can take their motion and second off the table to allow discussion of your potentially friendly amendment. If it's viewed as a non-friendly amendment, then clearly they're going to say that they're not going to add that in or not take their motion off the table, and therefore your amendment would not be incorporated.
Is there a recorded vote on that unfriendly amendment procedurally? Is one allowed?
Yeah, I mean, it's part of the minutes that amendment was offered by Councilman Adderholt and was not accepted by the motion maker or the seconder. Or it was.
But if you have 3 votes on the unfriendly amendment, you could call it for a recorded vote on that unfriendly amendment?
Yes.
Yes, the chair could recognize that and call for a vote on that.
Yeah, but let me just say, it's not my intention to be unfriendly. I'm just trying to understand the rules of the game here. Yeah.
Yeah, we haven't had that occur that I can recall. Usually the amendments are discussed and they're deemed to either be friendly or they're retracted.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean that situation couldn't arise. And if I just go back to the Vice Mayor's point about putting items on the agenda, I really do encourage you, unless it's extremely time sensitive, to bring it up at a council meeting so that myself and the other members of the staff are not being asked to perhaps run in 5 different directions based on how each of you might individually see how an issue should be addressed. So it's really helpful for staff efficiency if you.
So for council items, that's when we would say, hey, I've got this idea. and then you look around the room, if the mayor nods, the vice mayor nods, or you get strange.
Well, the way we've been doing it is the sort of the perfect way to do it
Yep.
is you bring it up during the agenda management section of the agenda. I would like to discuss this. Is there someone else who also thinks this is a good matter to be discussed? And usually we don't require a majority vote, but even if two people say that, yes, they would like to discuss something, we go forward and put it on the agenda.
Okay.
And it just helps us, A, keep the meetings organized, help us with prioritization, and make sure that we're not being sent off in 5 different directions and that may be in conflict with one another at the end of the day. So if it's something that is, an emergency situation or time critical, then of course, we would give that due consideration and perhaps put it on because it can't wait for that process I just explained.
And Roger, I didn't mean to be criticizing you when I indicated you instructed me to take it to council. I was just giving an example. I understand why you do it.
And I took it that way, Vice Mayor, and I appreciate it. And I appreciate your, and I think you exhibited today that you wanted to put something on agenda management, and you said, is there somebody else interested in this subject also? And I think that's the perfect example of how we should strive to conduct business.
I had something to add also on this subject that I think has been a weakness of ours lately, and that is, I think we need to be very careful that we are restating our motions when we vote on them. I've gotten a lot of questions from the public that they really don't understand what's happened during a meeting. They're not following it the way we are, and I've got to admit that sometimes we've talked about things and I'm not sure, as sure as I was afterwards, what has actually been accomplished. So I think it might be a good practice that we restate our motions every time before we take a vote.
I think I agree with you. It's a good practice because, I understand it's kind of difficult for one of you to jump up and say, I'm not really sure what the motion is anymore. So to avoid putting yourselves in that position, I think it's always a good practice to ask the clerk or the mayor to restate the motion right before the vote.
I've got a quick question. What's the difference between the consent and the administrative agenda, and how do things get on the consent agenda?
Things that we put on the consent agenda are things that we believe in our best estimation are well understood by the council and non-controversial. Occasionally we're wrong, but that's our best estimate. We don't feel badly about it if you remove it from the consent agenda and take it up individually. We're just trying to be respectful of your time.
And this is put on there by staff.
It's categorized by staff.
And Bill, our practice has been that if you have a question about an item on the consent agenda, that when we do the motion near the beginning of the meeting to approve the final agenda, that you ask to remove that item from the consent agenda. And no one has ever stopped anybody from doing that. But you remove it at that point before we vote on the final agenda.
Yeah, at that point, it either gets pulled out and the rest, if there are other consent items, they're passed, and then you take up that item individually, or it gets moved to the administrative agenda later in the meeting.
All right, thank you.
Any questions about procedural or parliamentary rules that we haven't already covered?
Would you just touch briefly on how the town utilizes resolutions versus ordinances?
Yeah, by law, in chapter 162 with 66, which is the Florida statute that recognizes home rule power of localities, it very specifically states in there, and I can cut and paste that and send to you all each what it is, and it defines an ordinance essentially as a law. Whereas a resolution is an expression of the council on a particular item that doesn't necessarily rise to the level of being an enforceable regulation. That is an ordinance.
Would it be like a sense of the Congress? It would be a resolution?
I'm sorry. Can you repeat that?
Would a resolution be similar to a sense of the Congress?
Yeah, it's an expression of interest or an expression of the council's view on a particular matter, whether that's actionable, for example, approving a contract and authorizing the manager to execute that or negotiate further. We wouldn't have two readings of an ordinance to approve a contract unless there's something in state law or your charter that says that particular subject matter has to be done by ordinance. So it's a way of conducting business short of adopting ordinances, which are an expression of law.
And John, would you, not for resolution or for resolution, but particularly for ordinances, would you just briefly delineate first reading versus second reading?
Yeah, again, chapter 166, 031, 41C, I know my memory, says that ordinances in the normal course of business, regular ordinances, require two readings. It actually goes on to say that only one of those readings requires a public hearing, but as a matter of custom, this council and previous councils have said that we are going to take public comment at first reading as well as second, although it's not legally required. Under state law. So at least one of those hearings, and generally it's the second hearing, has to be then formally advertised under the requirements of Chapter 166, which it has to be placed in the newspaper so many days before the public hearing. It has to state what the subject matter by title of the ordinance, has to indicate where the meeting is going to take place, where the ordinance is going to be considered, and it advises the public that they obviously have the opportunity to speak for or against or on the subject matter of the ordinance before it gets adopted.
A comment I would add to this is I think it's so important that everybody pay a lot of attention the first hearing, and that if we're going to make changes, that we try to make them during the first hearing. That way we have, and the staff has, an opportunity to look at whether there are any unintended consequences to the modifications that we're making. If you wait until the second hearing and we make some big changes, we have found later that sometimes those changes haven't necessarily been thought out well enough. So I would just encourage everybody to really pay attention to the first hearing as well as the second hearing. And if we're going to make big changes, it's my preference that we try to make them at that first hearing.
And just to follow up on that, I think you answered my question, but you can amend the ordinance in under both first and second reading?
We have.
Yeah. Yes. The distinction or the differentiation is that there are certain types of ordinances, generally land use, quasi-judicial items, that are required by law to be first vetted and recommended by the LPA. Again, that's by statute. In addition to that, depending upon the nature of that particular land use item, the particular notice is different. It has to be larger. It has to, include a map. There's details in there that obviously staff implements when we see those types of ordinances come forward at your request, rezonings, things of that nature. There is an additional level of public hearing, which is before the LPA, who then forwards their recommendation, obviously, to you all, and then it goes through the first and second reading at the council level. There are situations, and we obviously will advise you all of this, that resolutions, particular types of resolutions, do require a public hearing. And so they will be placed separately on your agenda under the public hearing portion. One that immediately comes to mind is when you adopt special assessments. There's been a lot of discussion that we've engaged a consultant to look at our stormwater utility rates. To the extent that those rates may change and go up, then we will have to have a public hearing before the resolution implementing those new rates can be adopted. There's some other instances where that is required. We obviously will flag those and place them in the appropriate portion of the agenda, because in some instances, such as the rate resolution, there's also some notice requirements in the local newspaper. So that's that. In answer to your your question, Councilmember Adderholt, that's really the distinction between ordinances and resolutions. There are obviously some exceptions, as I've just mentioned, but generally an ordinance is a manifestation of the council's policy by law, as opposed to an expression in a resolution. I think that we've covered that area. If there's, again, I want to, with regard to everything that we've discussed here, if there's any question that any of you may have that either after or you feel that wasn't sufficiently covered to answer any questions you might have, feel free to interrupt or follow up with me.
Yeah, if I just, before I bounce off, I just wanted to follow up on the comment from the Vice Mayor about the first reading, the importance of kind of trying to get all the questions and issues on an ordinance out at the first reading. That's really helpful, but if for some reason the meeting's over and 2 o'clock in the morning, the next day you have an epiphany, it's really better if you could let me know, because as we write up the blue sheet for the second reading, we can incorporate that. And when all the councils review the agenda, they will have these several-day notice of a possible epiphany that may come up, so they could think about it in advance, be prepared to deal with it at the second hearing, rather than get to the second hearing and be surprised by it and perhaps not be ready to vote and cause a delay or rescheduling of the item. So first hearing is great to work through the issue. Second best thing is if you do have a great idea that's after that, let me or John know so that we can put it in the blue sheet so everyone has advance notice to think through that great idea in advance of the second reading. Keep the agenda process efficient.
And from a practical standpoint, Roger or Vice Mayor, I'm guessing a lot of those second reading amendments come as a result of constituent input, having had a chance to digest the sandpaper and the observer and the coverage of our first meeting. I'm guessing that's from a practical standpoint where a lot of those tweaks come from. Is that fair?
Sometimes that's the case, but sometimes somebody just has an idea after, you sleep on it. And some great ideas have come up at second hearings. I don't want to say not to do that. It's just that I sometimes have felt that people haven't really carefully read the ordinances for the first hearing because they're thinking, oh, I have a second swat at this later.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to stress how important it is that we try to get it as good as we can at the first hearing.
Yeah, I think the other part of that is that a lot of the public do not read the item. They just get their information from media or social media, and they don't necessarily have the benefit of reading the entire item and or the backup information we provide on the blue sheets for you. So sometimes reacting without the full breadth of the issue.
Vice Mayor, and I apologize. My internet connection went unstable there and I got dropped. So I was in the midst of saying, I think that we've covered all of the substantive areas that we set out for ourselves in the agenda. But if there are any additional questions or particular subject matter that we want to take up now, I'm certainly willing to do so. If not, we can schedule another one for a future date, as I think was previously been discussed.
Yeah, just a real quick question.
Yes, sir.
In my head, I want to, before I forget, I think you've conveyed there are no limits to ex parte conversations as long as they're disclosed. Is that true throughout all of our duties? In other words, if somebody's coming in to have a fine reduced, coming to appeal to the council to have a fine reduced, are there any limits to our contact with that particular person or entity even though we disclose it, or can you meet and discuss that with them?
I think that there's a fair amount of common sense, particularly with those types of issues that are quasi-judicial and are requiring action to reduce, approve, or otherwise modify what you're allowing someone to do. Everyone has a viewpoint on some of those issues, or let me rephrase that. Different people may have differing views on some of those subject matters. The point of the ex parte communications is to disclose those, number one, and to assure everyone during the process by disclosing those communications that they're not going to be what dictates your decision making. The second component to quasi-judicial hearings, and please keep this in mind moving forward, all of you, is that you can only make your decision and base your decision on what you hear at the hearing. You can consider those ex parte communications to a degree, in the sense that you can consider them, but you have to give them lesser weight. And the reason why, and the reason why this rule has been established is, just as in courts, if only one side has the opportunity to talk to you, the other side doesn't have the ability to question and to say, oh no, that's not the case. And that is why you have the hearing. As Coach Denny Green said many years ago on behalf of the Cardinals, you play the game to win. You have the hearing to decide the matter, not ex parte communications. You're supposed to, you have ex parte communications or quasi-judicial matters have three hallmarks. One, that you observe the essential due process, provide notice and an opportunity for people to be heard. Number two, you base your decision on the law. In other words, your set of regulations. If your set of regulations say that you are supposed to consider criteria A, B, and C, that is all you can consider in determining whether or not someone has met the requirements or the entitlement to the actions that they're asking for. And three, your decision must be backed up by competent, substantial evidence in the record. And so that is why you're talking about what is being presented to you at the hearing, not what you necessarily hear from the outside. If that were the case, then there would be no need for a hearing. So you can have the ex parte communications, you have to disclose them, and you have to be able to state on the record or affirm at some point if necessary, I'm making my decision on what I what I'm hearing today in the course of this hearing, subject to the rules of procedure, and I'm basing my decision on what I've heard here today, not necessarily what I've heard from applicant or the next door neighbor outside of the confines of this hearing, because it's not subject to cross-examination or otherwise verification. It's just simple statements by one party or another without the benefit of the sunshine.
Hey, John. One point is I've heard a lot of counselors say as part of their ex parte disclosures, they did a site visit.
A site visit is considered to be an ex parte communication because you're out there to observe something. From a practical standpoint, particularly in a community as small as Fort Myers Beach, and to some degree, an ex parte a site inspection may be just driving down Estero Boulevard in reality, because you can see the property or the location that is the subject matter of what you're going to consider. So I think that in abundance of caution, a lot of council members or LPA members will say, I drove by the property, and in fact, I've heard some people say, well, I drive by there every day. So to the extent that you do have a site visit, it is appropriate to disclose it. And again, you cannot base your decision on the substance of that site visit or the ex parte communications to the exclusion of everything else. It works actually the opposite. You're supposed to give primary and significant consideration to what you hear at the hearing to the exclusion of the ex parte communications.
And just to jump in, Bill, the rule of thumb is you're better off mentioning something, even if you're not sure if it's technically an ex parte communication, than to just surmise that it wasn't. Because if you're wrong, it could result in a reversal. If someone could, prove it, and it's really a better approach from an abundance of caution.
Now, what if
You bumped into the person in Publix and they mentioned the project to you, you should mention it.
I'm thinking more about when it said like a site visit, I'm thinking about, like you said, something you physically observe rather than a conversation with one of the parties involved. So what if you do a site visit and then what the people are claiming is different? If they're saying it's blue and you drive by and see it's red.
Well, I think whether the reason in the process, and John will bear me out, the council is allowed to ask the applicant and staff questions is, if you observe something in the site visit that you believe, decision, you can ask those questions. And let's just say another example might be, let's say you did have an ex parte face-to-face communication with the applicant, and in their presentation, they never mentioned the building is blue. So I drove by and I thought the building was blue. Do you want to comment on that? And they may or may not comment on it. So you have those situations occur.
If I may, to add to that, Commissioner Veach, in your specific example, where I see that happening is, a neighbor says it's red. And based upon your site visit, it's blue. It would be appropriate for you to either ask the person who said it's red, what proof do you have that it's red? If not, then I'm not going to give your testimony credibility, or alternatively to ask either the applicant or staff, can you confirm that it is blue for me for the record?
If I do. Oh, I'm sorry, Bill. I just wanted to chime in, Bill, because your question's a really good one. John very eloquently set the table for everything we need to be focused on. All that being said, I really hope he doesn't discourage you from doing site visits, because I found them to be extremely helpful. But premised on everything John just said, of course. But don't let him talk you out of doing site visits. I'm not sure he's trying to, but they are really helpful.
Well, yeah, and I think I understand what he's saying. Is that you can go and you can observe and you can talk, but then everything you hear, see, taste, feel, whatever, you need to bring it into the hearing. So if you have a question about something, if you see something, you can ask the witnesses or the applicant or whatever a question about what you saw, then it's in the hearing.
Particularly specifically to the point that you want to make that a point of your decision-making process. If that's important to you, and sorry about that. If that issue is important to you for purposes of making sure it's part of the record, then yes, I would commend to each and every one of you to make sure that you identify that issue or that observation and ask all the parties, I would like you to comment on this. I believe this is an important aspect of this application. I've been told, again, it's blue. And, I'd like to hear, applicant, is it in fact blue? Parties who are objecting, do you agree it's blue? If you don't agree with that it's blue, explain to me why not. And that gives you the information that ultimately I think that all of you will need in order to be able to make an appropriate decision.
John?
Yes, ma'am.
I just had kind of a conclusion kind of statement if you think you're getting close to that point. I used to teach ethics classes to attorneys. And one thing that I always like to say at the end of the class was that we've discussed black and white, right and wrong, but there's nothing that keeps you from having your standards higher than what we discussed.
Yeah, you are absolutely correct, Vice Mayor. I know many jurisdictions that I've worked in where the council or the kind of committee or the commission, whatever they call themselves, has adopted, for example, the ex parte rule. And notwithstanding that ex parte rule, X number of those elected officials or appointed officials said, I don't care to hear from you. I don't want to be put in that position, and there's nothing that there's no no one can compel them. So if they decide to do that, I'm not even going to consider ex parte communications, and that's my policy. There, each and every one of you is free to do that if you so choose. You can always do higher. You can't go any lower than what the regulations say.
And I just wanted to add that, you know, a lot of times you got to look to your gut. And one of my favorite expressions from ethics trainings that we used was the appearance of impropriety. There may be something that you could get away with because it's technically not wrong, but how does it look to the public that you have engaged in that behavior? And I believe that most of the time our council's ethics have been up there, that we don't even engage in behavior that looks inappropriate. And I would love us to stay in that area where our ethics are considered high.
I appreciate that comment, when I got dropped, I was in the process of saying, you know, I think that we've covered all the materials that we've set out for ourselves. If not, please let me know. And to reinforce to each and every one of you, if there's any question or concern about anything we've discussed today or we discuss at any point in time, please feel free to reach out to me if you have a question or concern on these issues, particularly as they may relate to a specific item that's coming before you all. As we've discussed before, there are always shades of gray. We like to work in a world that is black and white, but we know that that is impossible. And I will leave you with one of my favorite comments with regards to local government and government in general is that perception is reality sometimes in the community. And so to some of the previous comments I made before, I'll leave you with a war story that I mentioned to one of the other commissioners earlier. Another community that I used to be attorney for many years, several council members were very close friends before and during their tenure together on that council, and it was very common for the two of those members to go out to dinner or to have a drink after a council meeting. And many instances they would ask me to, you know, hey John, you want to come along? And sometimes I would, sometimes I wouldn't. And in one of those particular occasions, we were sitting there having a late dinner, and two reporters came to the same restaurant. And as I was going about at one point away from the two council members, one of the reporters stopped me and said, hey, they're violating the sunshine. And I said, no, they're not. I said, number one, I'm the village attorney. I would never allow them to do that in my presence. And to the extent that they're talking about stuff, it's stuff that they've already voted on, or it's just social matters. The sunshine law, the public records law doesn't require you to stop having friendships. It didn't matter what I said. The newspaper the next day was council members violating the sunshine. Even though it was an incorrect statement, and it was more to generate people to stop and read the articles, because later on it says, well, you know, it really wasn't, we weren't sure what they were talking about, but it looked like perception is reality. Sometimes, many times. Any questions before I let you go? Let's go.
Well, social distancing certainly makes it easier to avoid sunshine violations.
Fair enough. I appreciate your time. I'm here to answer any questions that you may have at any time. I'm a phone call, email away, certainly during COVID-19. And I look forward, as always, to continue working with each and every one of you all.
Very helpful.
Thanks, John. I'm out.
Okay, we don't need to adjourn, right? This is after the meeting?
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah, in a bunch of caution, someone can say motion to adjourn and we're done. It is a workshop setting. A lot of the regular regulations don't apply here. No actions being taken, but we certainly are adjourning at this point in time the workshop.
Well, I'll make a,
It is a
I'll make a,
public.
yeah, I'll make a motion. We adjourn just for the sake of clarity.
Second.
Bye, everybody.
Good night.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you.
12:32 p.m.